Chapter 21. Imlor Tula, Adventurer. Level not applicable. Gnome Kakenian. 2 cards? I asked incredulously. Yes, Mona said. We were going to have them go with the main caravan, but they don't want to leave for another 2 days. If you're willing to take them yourself, we'll happily supply you with the additional cart you'll need. And all I've got to do is take the passengers to the capital? Correct. 8 passengers total. Most are adventurers, but you will need to spring for a guard force. Adventurers? Can't I just pay them to guard the caravan? I chuckled. If you can afford them, Mona smirked. 4 of them are over 20s and the other 3 are over 5s. Yeesh, I can afford the over 5s, but even one over 20 is too rich for my blood, I said. We don't have a lot of time. What's your decision? Of course I'll do it. A free cart? I'd have to be dumb to say no. Good, Mona said with satisfaction. We'll get it attached to your current one, and your passengers will arrive soon. I nodded my understanding as the chief's aide turned and walked away. Things had gone well for me since the debacle with the giant rats. I'd made more than enough to replace my nurses and patch my cart up. Now they were going to give me another cart, and all I have to do in exchange is to take some adventurers back to the capital with me. Despite not even technically being a village, Nuleva always treats me pretty well. I watched as some orcs attached the new cart to the rear of my own. They also moved the goods I'd purchased and evened them out between the carts to make room for seating. I walked over to inspect my new cart. It was well constructed. Hell, I'd wager it's worth more than my original cart is in its current condition. Buff snorted at me, smelling the yipple in my pack. I chuckled as I pulled it out, ripped it in half, and gave Buff and Regal each a piece. Telena's going to roll her eyes when she hears my new Nas's names, but I've never been good at naming stuff. Anyone who has any doubt of that may certainly ask Imlor Tula too. I'm glad I was able to get them for a good price, but I still felt a pang of grief at the loss of Noble and Hulk. These Nases are much larger than Noble and Hulk had been, because they're bred specifically for pulling heavy loads at speed. They also have a certain aggression behind their eyes, like they're looking for an excuse to attack something. It's a tad unnerving, but it might just be my imagination. They'd been remarkably well behaved so far. Are you our driver? Someone from behind me asked. I turned to see a group of adventurers and a messenger. The messenger had been the one who spoke. I opened my mouth to respond, but surprise took my voice as I examined the other adventurers. 4 unfamiliar orcs, 2 familiar orcs, and what I now know to be a human. Oh, it's you, Nash said. Hi, Imlor, how have you been? Nick asked with a smile. I've been good, I managed to say. I'm surprised to see you here. You're the adventurers that I'm taking to the capital. Yes, Yulk interjected. We've been summoned by the High Chief himself. Are we ready to go? The messenger asked with annoyance at being ignored. Not yet. I've got to hire some guards. I'm available, one of the largest orcs I've ever seen said with a grin. 3 of the other adventurers looked at him with exasperated expressions. I remembered what Mona had said and realized that these were the over 20s. The mountainous one notwithstanding, the other 3 didn't look particularly different from normal adventurers. One was a spellcaster, another was obviously a blade expert, and the third had the unassuming posture of a skilled rogue. If you're one of the over 20s, I'm afraid I can't afford your services, I replied gently. Ah, hell, you're doing me a favor by taking me to my payday, he said with a laugh. I'll give you a discount. How's 50 copper sound? We could use the money too, Nash added. 50 copper for myself and my 2 brothers as well. Nick looked at Nash with confusion. My sword's broken, and isn't your axe chipped? Nash looked back at him and replied, My axe still has plenty of teeth, and you've still got your spells. We'll be able to handle just about anything we run into on the road. 2 silver isn't bad for guards. I'd been expecting to pay at least 5. Plus, I've seen the Alta brothers in action. There's no doubt that they're capable of guarding the caravan. Deal, I said before they could change their minds. Well, that settles that. We're ready to get on our way. Hop aboard. I excitedly climbed into the coach box and grabbed the reins. The Narses shifted slightly as the adventurers and messenger took their seats. I watched until they were settled, and then urged Buff and Regal to start pulling. The Hnasis began to pull the two carts effortlessly. I'd been a little worried whether or not they could handle it, but my fears were unfounded. Once I was certain they were following the trail without guidance, I turned back to my passengers for some chit-chat. After learning everyone's names, I asked what was really on my mind. "So why does the High Chief want to see you?" I asked. "He wants to meet Nick, and we're probably getting dragged along due to association," Nash answered. I couldn't tell if he was upset about that or not. Nash has an odd bit of stoicism, it seems. "Did you make out okay?" Nick asked. "Were you able to still make a profit off the stuff we saved?" "Yes, and thanks again for the timely rescue. I was able to fulfill the most profitable of my orders and get my cart all patched up. I even got new Hnasis," I answered excitedly. "Meet Buff and Regal." "Nice to meet you," Nick said with a smile. The Hnasis ignored him and continued striding ever forward. I chuckled at their lack of reaction. "What happened to your sword anyway?" I asked. "It broke. A boss in the dungeon cut right through it." "Ah, a pity. So you're in the market for a new one then?" "No, I'm going to try to have it repaired." "Ah," I winced. "Is it enchanted?" "No. Why?" "Well, it's usually cheaper to replace a broken blade than it is to fix it. I learned that from my son," I laughed. "You have kids?" Nash asked. "Yep, 2 sons and a daughter. The eldest is a level 3 adventurer already." I beamed. "I'm hoping one of my other children will opt to take over the family business, though." "Why not hire your son as a guard?" "Guard duty is boring, apparently. It also doesn't pay well until you're over level 5, I explained. I'd obviously pay him more than a normal guard, but the lack of entertainment is a big issue for my boy. He prefers the adventuring part of being an adventurer. Your clan's bond could be stronger then. I would work on that with your other children." The criticism stung, but I knew it wasn't coming from a malicious place. Nash seems like the honorable sort, and giving harsh advice is one of their greatest displays of kindness. He's not wrong either. Imlaw 2 and I are civil, but we don't see each other nearly as often as I'd like. I tell myself that it's just because we're busy with work, but the truth is, I wasn't exactly a great father, and the end result of that is a wedge between us. A tale as old as time, business always came first. I know it's wrong, but it was ever so easy to justify at the time. I'd considered myself a good dad because I never hit my family, and they never went hungry. Unfortunately, I didn't realize until my son had grown from a boy to a man that that's the bare minimum of fatherhood. I'd missed out on his growth and didn't make myself available to help mold him. He'd grown into a stranger to me, and I'd let it happen. Now the consequences tear through me like a knife. It's mostly small things, like how he sends letters addressed to his mother instead of to me, or how he'll go see his friends in town before coming home after an adventure. I'd already resolved to do better by my other children, but it hurt that Nash had been able to see the truth of our relationship after such a brief discussion. "That's not an appropriate critique, brother," Yulk interjected. "Do we need to work on your social graces again?" "No, I'll do better, I swear." Nash held up his hands in mock horror. "Seriously, though, I was out of line, Imlaw. I apologize." "I appreciate the apology, but you're right," I sighed. "Business has always kept me away from my family, but even when I was home, I didn't exactly make time for the boy." "My father would play games with us," Yhesith added. "Mine would spar with me until we couldn't move anymore," Thunra said with a nod. "Mine had to work a lot, but made time to take us on vacations whenever he could. Mostly local, but it was still fun," Nick said sadly. Everyone fell silent at the soft grief in Nick's voice. It hadn't really occurred to me that the human had family back in his world. It reminded me of when I was stuck in the tree, wishing desperately to see my family once again. A terrible feeling indeed. Nash put his hand on Nick's shoulder. "Our dad used to do the same thing before he died," Nash said. "I don't know if most people would count monster hunting trips as vacations," Yulk added with a chuckle, "and I'm certain that Nick doesn't." "Well, it got us out of the house and strengthened our bond, did it not?" Nash asked irritably. "How did he pass, if you don't mind me asking?" I interrupted. Yulk and Nash looked at each other for a moment and shrugged. "He was poisoned by an enemy of our family," Yulk explained casually. "Heartbane. Nothing could be done." Yep, and then Mom hunted the poisoner down and carved him into little pieces in front of everyone, Nash said. We wanted to come with, but she made us stay home. Didn't want us to see that, but we heard about what happened from a city guard years later. Nick's expression had gone from sad to shocked. The only face that wasn't showing surprise was Thunra's, who nodded along to the story as if it was something he'd heard before. Don't fuck with the Alta clan, he said quietly. It was on this somber and terrifying note that I opted to turn my attention back to the road. We've been making good time, and the change from forest to desert is now within view. This was the portion of road where I had met Nick, Nash, and Yulk. I shuddered at the memory of the giant rats. Hey, I recognize that tree, Nick said as the tree that had been my home for a time came into view. Wait, where's the giant rat bodies? Eaten, presumably, Yulk answered. There are a lot of predators in the wastes. It would be a terrible omen if a corpse were to last longer than a day. Why's that? Nick asked. It would mean that an apex predator is nearby. Grim but accurate. There isn't much that is natural about the wastes, but even monsters follow the pecking order. Anything that can be killed without too much of a fight is prey, regardless of what that prey eats in turn. There are some predators who are simply too fast or too strong to be considered prey by anything else, and these apex predators are notoriously difficult to kill. Well, it's a good thing that I don't see any signs of our fight then, Nick said. So, the wastes, they were caused by the Cataclysm War, right? Wars. There were more than one, Joni said, perking up for the first time since he got on the cart. 5 total, and 3 of them were fought simultaneously. Oh, okay. Who was fighting? Everyone. These cataclysmic conflicts were aptly named. The world nearly ended. He doesn't just mean all life on the planet either. The magics involved threatened to break our world on multiple occasions, Yulk added. It got so bad that not much is actually known about the conflicts themselves, because hardly anyone survived to write their histories. That's right, Joni nodded sadly. There's an account carved in stone in the dwarven kingdom of Prignera on the southern continent. But it's unknown if the account is accurate because there's no way to verify it. Ain't Prignera one of them bunker countries where the whole thing is pretty much underground? Thunra asked, to which Joni nodded again. Wait. Okay, so hold on. You don't know what started the fighting? Nick interrupted. Not for certain, Joni answered. However, the account in Prignera says that demons conspired to convince all the countries of Myr to attack each other. And once that war was nearly finished, the forces of Hell invaded our plane of existence. These were the first 2 Cataclysm Wars. Wait, Hell exists here? Nick incredulously asked. Again, we don't know for certain. A lot of scholars believe that demons are a convenient scapegoat, created to cover up the magical experimentation that went on during these conflicts, Joni explained. The demons won the Second Cataclysm War, according to the account. But their victory was short-lived. The Third Cataclysm War began when the Aniels from the Plane of Haven invaded, supposedly to restore order and free the Myr from the tyranny of the demons. They managed to take half of every continent, but were fought to a standstill. What about the 4th and 5th? Didn't they happen at the same time as the 3rd? Yes. The Aniels ruled over their Myr with just as much tyranny as the demons did. Less slavery and butchery, but even the pettiest of crimes were met with extremely harsh punishments. This was the order that they so craved, but mortals require a balance of order and chaos to happily live our lives. The demons saw this and made a fatal mistake, Joni said. They convinced some of the Myr who were living under the Aniels to rebel. Once they did, the demons went on the offensive. However, the sight of mortals fighting against the Aniels inspired those who were subjugated by the demons to rebel as well. The war between the Aniels and the Myr was the 4th Cataclysm War, and the war between the demons and the Myr was the 5th. Demons fighting Aniels, Myr fighting demons, and Myr fighting Aniels. Everything natural in this world rose up against the 2 occupying armies and fought them back to their own planes. Never to be seen or heard from again. Thunra finished with a laugh. I don't know how much stock I put in tales like that. Think I'm of the belief that powerful mages were fucking with forces they don't understand, and opted to cover it up once the dust settled. That is the more plausible explanation, But there's technically less evidence of that, Joni countered. Lack of evidence is usually evidence of a cover-up, Thunra said, spoken like a city guard. You ever think about a career change? Yulk grinned. 3 hots and a cot don't sound so bad, but my PA would have my balls if I even tried. Everyone laughed as we continued our journey. Chapter 22. Nick Smith, Adventurer Level 5, Human American. Come on, kiddo, you gotta keep your guard up, Thunra shouted. What does that even mean? I asked in frustration as I got off the ground. I felt a bit of drool drip down my chin. I wiped at it and my hand came back bloody. A slight sting told me that Thunra had split my lip. Angry, I once again put my fists up. All right, see, your hands are too close together. You gotta be able to see all of me, Thunra explained. Also, you don't really gotta be making fists. You're supposed to be stopping me from hitting you, not trying to hit me. This is how boxers do it, though, I countered. I don't know what that is, Thunra laughed, but it ain't working for you. I opened my hands and spread them apart until I could see all of Thunra. He grinned and rushed at me. I immediately activated time dilation, but it hardly seemed to slow the gigantic orc down. He swung his massive fist, and I was able to barely redirect the punch so that it sailed past my head. I clenched my left hand and sent it at Thunra's face as I felt something hit me in the gut. Time dilation deactivated, and I went flying back. I slammed into the ground and rolled, gasping for air and getting a mouthful of dirt for my troubles. You managed to block a punch. That's great. Good job, Nick, Thunra shouted with glee as I sputtered. Yeah, great, I managed to say once I could breathe again. I spit the rest of the dirt out of my mouth and rose to my feet again. My legs, however, had other plans and gave out on me. I sighed as I pushed myself back up. You all right? Thunra asked. My legs are wobbly. You got me pretty hard, I answered. Oh damn, sorry about that. I'll dial it back a bit. I was going at 75, but I think I overshot your abilities a bit. I'll drop to 50%. It is difficult to describe the wave of emotions that washed over me upon learning that the giant orc brawler had already been holding back. Anger at myself for not being able to keep up. Happiness that he's going to be holding back even more, and shock at how much power the bastard actually has. I suggest a short break while I repair your spleen, Ten said. My spleen? Yes, that last impact slightly ruptured it. I've got it under control, but it will be easier if you to lay down for a few minutes. As logic overwrote adrenaline, the pain where Thunra had hit me got worse. A lot worse. It radiated from my upper left torso, just behind the bottom ribs. It felt like my stomach was on fire and my body was trying to blow out that fire with a needle tornado. I held up one hand and laid on the ground. The pain slowly began to ebb as Thunra walked over to me with a curious expression. I need a minute. Apparently you ruptured my spleen, I said as casually as I could. Oh shit, Thunra said. You gonna be okay? Do we need to call Yulki? Unnecessary. Healing magic will interfere. Ten's got this. Just need a few minutes is all. Thunra walked over and sat next to me while Ten repaired the injury. So, what's a spleen anyways? He asked. I'm not 100% sure. Think it has something to do with filtering blood like the liver, I answered. The spleen controls the level of white blood cells, red blood cells, and blood platelets contained within your blood. It also screens the blood and removes any old or damaged red blood cells, Ten explained. Never mind. Ten explained it. It filters the blood and controls the levels of white and red blood cells, I said. Handy little thing, Thunra chuckled. I'm guessing that's not a vital organ, right? The skill I used is supposed to incapacitate, not kill. Humans can live without a spleen, but a ruptured spleen causes internal bleeding that can become fatal within 24 to 48 hours. Ten says it's not a vital organ, but a ruptured one bleeds inside you and can be fatal after a day or two if it isn't fixed, I answered. All right, that makes sense. Thunra sighed in relief. If you walk around with that much pain for 2 days, you're kinda asking for it, you know? I lay there silently, letting Ten do its thing. I found it kind of interesting that Thunra's skill was supposed to incapacitate me, but could have ended up killing me in the long run. If you looked at it in terms of black and white, the skill failed. However, a ruptured organ would definitely incapacitate most people, and a ruptured spleen isn't fatal if you get it treated. So in a way, the skill did exactly what it was supposed to do. I guess skills aren't perfect, and it's probably important to keep that in mind. Don't want to accidentally cause someone's death when I'm just trying to get them to stop fighting. Even though I hadn't learned a skill from our sparring yet, Thunra had still taught me a lesson. Spleen repaired, you're good to go, Ten said. I enjoyed laying down for a few seconds before sitting up. All right, I'm ready. Good, Thunra said, helping me up. We'll try again, but this time I want you to focus on evading my strikes. I'm going to hit you with a flurry unless you stop me. I nodded resolutely. A flurry involves a lot of punches happening very quickly. Definitely don't want to get hit with that. I took my stance and Thunra charged. He swung with his right fist, and I activated time dilation again. I pushed his right fist upward with my left hand and elbowed his left fist away from me. His hands quickly tucked back into him and came at me again, but I kept deflecting them. Right, left, both left, right. Time dilation wore off, but I was still managing to keep up with his strikes. Barely. Then his left fist did something weird. It seemed to be in 3 places at once. I blocked one of the strikes, but the 2 others were going to hit me. Preternatural evasion unlocked. My foot pushed off of the ground on its own, and my body twisted out of the way of the other 2 strikes, and even managed to avoid a surprise right-handed attack. I moved faster than I thought that I could, and Thunra noticed the change in speed. He held up his hands and grinned. Whoa, okay, let's stop, he said. Was that a new skill? Yeah, I said, once again out of breath. Preternatural evasion. Oh, the dodge one. Congratulations. Thanks. I concentrated on the skill's name, and the box popped up. Preternatural evasion 1. Allows a user to automatically dodge for 1 minute. Cooldown 10 minutes. Automatically dodge? I asked. Yeah, you move on your own, Thunra answered. Well, not that you don't already move on your own. I guess you could say. I zoned out as Thunra struggled to explain the concept of automatic movement. Preternatural evasion seems like a very useful skill, but the 10-minute cooldown could be an issue. Maybe if I level it up, the cooldown will decrease. Hey Ten, you level a skill up by using it, right? I asked. For the most part, certain skills require milestones to be met before they will level up, regardless of whether or not the skill is utilized. These milestones are generally able to be met quicker by using the skills, though. Other skills require a deeper understanding of the nature of the skill to level up, which usually occurs naturally while using the skill, Ten explained. It's exceedingly rare for a skill that can level up not to do so as you use it. I understand. So what does Preternatural Evasion 2 look like? Does the cooldown decrease at all? Well, I can't tell you. Something is stopping me. What? What's stopping you? I do not know. I can tell you all about your current skills, but I can't give you details about ones you don't have, Ten said. Do you want to know more about Preternatural Evasion Unyi? No. No, I got it. Well, that's concerning and annoying. I don't even know if leveling up Preternatural Evasion is going to be worth it or not, and now I've got to worry about whatever's keeping Ten from telling me stuff about skills. It's probably the Kuraguard or whatever, but I wonder what else Ten can't tell me. Like one of them machines, you know? Thunra asked, clearly looking for an answer. Yeah, sure, I replied. You ready to go again? Thought you'd never ask, he said with a grin. As we took our stances, it occurred to me that I didn't know how much time was left on the cooldown for Preternatural Evasion. A right hook to the face quickly let me know that it hadn't finished cooling down quite yet. Thankfully, Yisith interrupted our sparring match before any more punches could be thrown. Time to head out, she said. Thunra complained a bit, but we ended up loading up onto the wagons and continuing on our way, ending my first bout of training. We didn't train on the first day of our journey because we had left in the afternoon and didn't stop until it was dusk. Well, except for bathroom breaks. I went over the results of my training in my head as we drove on. 10, is there a way to see the cooldowns for my skills? I asked. Yes, you don't currently have any on cooldown, but when you do, you'll see it in the upper right corner of your vision, Ten said. I set the opacity to 25% so that it doesn't impede your vision.
Thanks.
We continued on until dusk, stopped, rested, woke up, had breakfast, and got back on the road once again. Most of the discussions were how to best season certain meats that I'd never heard of, with Imlaw chiming in when a spice that also paired well with vegetables was mentioned. I was too busy dreading my training with Nash to participate in the conversation much. My dread grew worse and worse as the sun rose higher and higher into the sky. Finally, the cart stopped, and Nash was the first to jump out. My turn, he said, while grabbing 2 wooden swords. You'll be on offense today. My spirits rose at this, and I happily caught the sword he tossed at me. It shouldn't hurt so bad if I'm the one doing the swinging, right? We walked a short distance away from everyone else and took our stances. Begin, he said. I immediately charged at him with an underhand swing to try to throw him off balance. I glanced at the ground to be sure of my footing, and my vision went dark. I shook my head in confusion, and as my sight came back, I found myself with a very familiar view. I watched a cloud drift by for a moment, then got up. The hell happened? I asked Ten. He leapt forward and kicked you in the forehead. You're fine, though. I looked up at Nash and was greeted by an awfully smug expression. Keep your eyes on your opponent, he condescendingly said. Try again. This time I tried for a horizontal strike and activated time dilation. Nash must have seen this coming because the blunted point of his blade was exactly where my forehead had to be to complete my strike. If I had used dash, I'd have been knocked out. I silently cursed to myself and managed to barely avoid the counterattack, backing off in the process. A timer that said time dilation appeared and began counting down from 5 minutes. Good, you're not quite as bad as you used to be, Nash laughed. Try again. Shit, I said, staring at the timer. I took a deep breath and decided on my course of action. I ran toward Nash and activated slide slash. He leapt backward, and I threw my sword at his face and used dash to get closer. I balled up my fist and prepared to activate Breathtaker Strike, but Nash spun around quickly, turning his back to prevent the skill from activating. I brought up my left hand to block the elbow that he threw at my face, but couldn't stop the force he put behind it. My hand smashed into my face, and I slammed into the ground. Cloud watching again? Ten asked. Not helpful. My bones seemed to creak as I once again got off the ground. The wooden sword I had thrown at Nash landed at my feet. You shouldn't throw your weapon unless you have another one handy, Nash said. Your fists don't count quite yet, by the way. Then why did you avoid them? I asked sarcastically. Because I can, and that's my point. What good is a weapon that can't hit its target? I mean, it would hit most targets. The only reason it didn't hit you is because you were expecting it, I pointed out. The reason I can't land a hit is because you have more experience than I do, and you know my fighting style. It's not fair. Nash's laughter interrupted me. Why would that matter? He asked sardonically. It's not as if I'd be doing you any favors by letting you hit me. You grow as you figure out how to hit me, and of course it isn't fair. This isn't some rich nobleman's tournament. We're training to make sure you don't die when faced with monsters. Or would you rather have 10 do all the work? I inwardly cringed. Nash had hit a nerve with the 10 comment, and I was immediately embarrassed by my misconceptions. No, I don't want 10 to do any of the work, I answered. I don't want to be like that thing. Nash's attitude changed. His smugness evaporated, and he suddenly became concerned. Did 10 say something about that? He asked. No, just an assumption on my part, I replied. Intuition, I suppose. The man in the dungeon did have an AI, but it was in standby mode when we fought, 10 said. How do you know? It didn't respond to any of my attempts at communication. What if it didn't want to talk or couldn't? That hadn't occurred to me. I suppose it is a possibility. I opted to keep that to myself as Nash sighed. Listen, Nick, do you know what the most important thing to do in a fight is? Protect others, I asked. Right, he scratched the back of his neck. I was actually going to say survive. I guess it's kind of complicated. But if you've got the option to survive and to help others survive, you should take a hold of that option with both hands. So if it comes to that, don't hesitate to rely on 10. In every other situation, though, you should be fighting with your own 2 hands. All right, I understand, I said. I do kind of understand where Nash is coming from, but something feels wrong about using 10 to fight. My dad always used to say that the easy road has hidden pitfalls. I might be biased because I don't like the idea of something else controlling my body, but I can't seem to shake the feeling that there's some sort of cost to 10 taking over. Maybe I'm just being paranoid. That's enough stalling, Nash said with a grin. Try again. Chapter 23. Yulk Alta, Adventurer Level 7, Orc Nulavan. We've been on the road for 4 days, and the trip has been mostly uneventful. Nash and Thunra were pummeling some semblance of a fighting style into Nick, and we're making great time on our way to the capital. The only thing we've run into so far is other travelers, and because of this, our spirits are high. Well, except for Nick's. I grinned at the boy as he collapsed into his seat, fresh from sparring with Thunra. My grin was met with a stoic yet weary expression. His training had been difficult, but I'd only had to help heal him once. 10 does an amazing job at keeping Nick functional. My grin faded as the AI came to mind. I recalled the metal box that fell out of the dungeon creature's splattered brains. There's little doubt that it contained a being like 10, and 10 had also seemed to know to look for it. Although that could be attributed to amazing reaction time. If the crazed human in the dungeon had an AI in its head, who was controlling the body? Perhaps the AI was like 10 before it woke up, and the human simply lost his mind due to the tragic nature of his situation. He had to have been down there for a very long time, so that could have cost him his sanity as well. Being alone in the dark for years, perhaps even decades. It was no wonder he turned feral. I supposed it is also possible that the AI had gone insane along with the human. If something can think, it can likely also feel. And anything that can feel can go mad. This begets the question, which went insane first? Did the human's insanity cause the AI to go feral, or did the AI's insanity cause the human to lose it? Are we there yet? Nick asked, jarring me from my thoughts. Nope, soon though, Imlaw answered. If all goes well, we'll be at the outskirts of the capital around dusk. We'll make camp there and be at your destination by noon tomorrow. Why haven't we run into anything killable yet? I laughed and said, we got lucky. Imlaw has taken us on an adventurer's route, which would normally be a more dangerous option. I suspect that the reason for our luck is all the other travelers we've seen so far. Since they are also adventurers, they would have fought any monsters they came across. I was sure we were going to be able to fight something when we went through the swamp, Nick muttered. Now we're back in the forest, though. Feeling a bit aggressive, are we? I asked condescendingly. Not going to lie to you, Yulk. Yes, I am. Very. Nash and Thunra are leagues above me when it comes to experience. I'm rarely able to even land a hit, he ranted. It's not good for my confidence, you know. Well, the High Chief will have a quest waiting for us. Maybe it will involve fighting monsters. I hope so. It's not so bad, Imlaw interjected. You got some new skills, right? Yeah, Nick sighed. 2 skills in 4 days. You say that like you were expecting more, I said. A new skill every 2 days is quite a feat, even with trainers like Thunra and Nash. Really? Yes, most people unlock skills as they go, and usually in combat with tough monsters. Training a new skill outside of combat can take weeks. That's one of the reasons I opted to go into magic instead of melee, I grinned again. Nick laughed. It's not like you had much of a choice, though, right? Sure I did. I could have been a warrior like Nash, and it would have been just as hard for me as it was for him. But since I was blessed with a better-than-average magic core, I was able to dedicate my time to magic instead. Since it's extremely difficult to train both martial and magical prowess simultaneously, everyone was very understanding when I chose magic and didn't bother to learn to swing an axe. So what you're saying is that I've got it lucky? He laughed again. How come it doesn't feel like it? It's pretty common to be lucky and also completely oblivious to it, I answered. Nick fell into silent contemplation as everyone else finished loading into the carts. As we continued our journey, I wondered about Nick's propensity for advancement in regards to his skills. It seems to go a bit beyond him simply being a natural at combat. Could it be something related to his species, perhaps? Maybe humans are simply a jack-of-all-trades kind of race. On the other hand, the creature from the dungeon didn't use any magic. It could be that it was unable to due to its mental state. Some monsters stop using magic when they frenzy, and if a sorcerer is sufficiently stressed, their spells are affected as well. It's entirely possible that at one point it could use magic, so perhaps we should simply be thankful that it couldn't at the time. Come to think of it, Nick described his magic channels as being straight. I didn't put much thought into it at the time, wrote it off as an odd quirk of an unfamiliar species, but after seeing the metal box fall out of that other human's head, I can't help but wonder. Are they artificial? Nick had said that the world he comes from doesn't have magic, but could that be due to the fact that humans simply can't naturally use magic? Why would someone go through the effort of making sure humans could use magic? What materials would one even use to create an artificial magic core and channels? No, that's not even the biggest problem with this line of thought. How would one possibly create the magic that fills the core and in such quantities to power through a misconceived visualization trigger? Nick's wind spear had been very powerful for a beginner, and I had been under the impression that it was due to his knowledge of the concept of wind. After hearing him explain how he thought wind worked to Matri, well, it can't be denied that he had inadvertently put a massive amount of magical force into the spell. Like a beast that doesn't know its own strength trying to use a fragile piece of equipment. Thrilling, I muttered to myself. Several pairs of eyes turned to look at me simultaneously. I waved a hand in a nonchalant way to indicate I was speaking to myself. "Don't worry, he gets like that sometimes," Nash said in my defense. The eyes went about their business and left me to sum up my thoughts. Nick has a massive amount of potentially artificial core magic, and I have no way of determining if that magic is natural or not without hurting the boy. Damn it all, we should have performed an autopsy on the feral one. It had simply not occurred to me at the time. I was more concerned with the fact that we survived the encounter. "Which skills did you learn anyway?" Imlaw asked Nick, bringing me back to reality. "Preternatural evasion and knife hand," Nick answered. "Knife hand?" I asked. "Yeah, it makes my hand hard when I do this." He held up his outstretched hand, with all his fingers pressed tightly together. "And that makes my karate chops do a lot of damage. It can also intimidate weaker enemies if I point it at them." "Huh, sounds handy," I grinned. Everyone had been listening in and were punished for their nosiness by my wordplay. I met the groans with a chuckle. "Right, so puns aside, what does preternatural evasion do?" Imlaw asked. "It lets him automatically dodge attacks that can be dodged," Thunra answered. "Both skills are very useful for weaponless brawling." I looked at Nash and gave him a slightly smug smirk, then turned back to Nick. "So you didn't learn any sword skills?" I asked with a malicious grin. "No, he fucking didn't," Nash growled. "And if you're trying to imply that it's my fault, I'll kick your ass right off this cart." Oh no, I would never dream of blaming Nick's swordsmanship instructor for his lack of sword skills, I said with measured sarcasm. "My skin is tougher than your words," Nash replied while crossing his arms. "You won't rile me up." "Any further than he already has?" Matri asked innocently. "Oh, so now it's a group effort, is it?" Nash shouted. Our laughter rang out through the trees and almost masked the sound of wood crunching. Everyone except for Imlaw stopped laughing and immediately turned towards the sound. "Stop the cart," I said. "Dibs," Nick shouted as he leapt from the cart. "The hell does dibs mean?" Nash asked as he jumped after Nick. I waited for the cart to come to a halt before climbing off. Nick and Nash were joined by Thunra, whom I hadn't even seen move. They were already about 50 yards ahead of me. Nick reached for his belt and then, remembering he doesn't have a sword, slowed to allow the other two to catch up. Before they could, though, two thick trees turned to splinters as a massive red and yellow beast crashed through them. It took a second to gain its bearings and then roared a challenge at us, exposing rows of fangs and a tongue with a stinger on the tip. Its four eyes focused on Nick, and it stepped forward. "What the hell is that thing?" Nick shouted. Nash glanced at me, unsure of what we were looking at. Fair, considering we hadn't seen one before. The coloration was confusing, not designed to supply camouflage in a forest at all. But that's because it isn't designed to be camouflaged, nor is it supposed to be in a forest. Its domed skull covered in metallic spikes told me exactly what it was. "It's a nalim," Thunra shouted. "Get back." A nalim, a creature created in a twisted time of disastrous war. designed specifically to breach barricades and destroy defenders while drawing attention away from other attackers. The 3 claws on each limb were capable of cracking through stone like the sharpest of picks, and to add to its lethality, its creators had made it venomous. A terrible creature, and most unfortunate that we find one so close to the capital. We have to kill it. "Rapes Denivtsak," Nick shouted, ignoring the sage advice that the brawler had given him. Wind slashed around us as his spell launched toward the nalim. It was a very powerful attempt, and I covered my eyes to protect them from the dust it kicked up. Despite the foolishness of the action, I found myself with a sense of pride for my pupil. Once the wind died down, though, Nick was on the ground with a very nasty-looking gash in his chest. Joni rushed past me to his aid. Knowing that Joni would keep Nick alive, I focused on the nalim. It wasn't undamaged, but its injury could be considered a minor flesh wound for one of its ilk. Its metallic skull glimmered in the sun, and 2 of the spikes had been shorn clean off. Ochre-colored blood oozed from the flesh, still clinging desperately to the remaining spikes. No, Wind Spear wouldn't work against such a foe. There's a specific class of spell one must cast to destroy a nalim, and it has to be a powerful one. The monster shook its head and stepped toward Nick and Joni, clearly angry at the injury it sustained. Nash and Thunra stepped in, slashing and punching respectively. The creature's attention turned, and it immediately began fighting them. I dropped my staff and raised both hands, feeling the arcane energies swell within my head. I focused on the glimmer of the nalim's exposed skull and decided which spell to use. Nash and Thunra were in the way, though, dodging tooth, tongue, and claw. "Get out of the way," I shouted. The 2 veteran fighters glanced at me for a millisecond before making a run for it. The nalim looked at the 2 of them, unsure of which one to pursue. The hair on my arms stood on end as I began my visualization. Electrical energy, unbelievably powerful, moving at the speed of light toward the exposed metal. Klobsrolmitsak. My eyes felt as if they were on fire, my chest felt as if it had been kicked by a hnas, and my arms burned as the lightning bolt traveled from me to the nalim. The strike was instant, and giant monster collapsed to the ground. I grinned in satisfaction as my legs gave out and I fell to my knees. I gasped through the pain, letting it roll through me and keeping myself calm as it did so. "It's just a little pain, no need to panic." "Yulk!" Nash shouted as he ran up to me. "Are you hurt?" "Yes, but it's fine," I waved him off. "Imlaw's bolt is a hell of a spell, brother. How's Nick?" "He seems all right," Thunra answered as he approached. "Not even bleeding anymore. Joni looks like he's seen a ghost, though. You sure you're okay?" "Yes," I said, grabbing my staff and rising to my feet. "It's pain, not an injury. It's just one of the costs of the spell." "Huh?" they asked in unison. "Most spells just cost magic to cast, but certain spells cost a little something extra. A sort of curse to remind one to use the spell sparingly," I explained. "Never mind that, let's check on Nick." They eyed me warily as we walked over to Joni and Nick. Thunra was right. Joni looked terrified. His pale face looked up at us, and he pointed to Nick. It spoke," he whispered. "What's that? Speak up." Thunra held a hand to his ear. He said, "It spoke." "By it, I'm assuming he means 10, I said. "The robot in Nick's head?" "The very same." "Oh, cool," Thunra grinned. Joni looked at us, his shock turning to incredulity and finally to anger. "You knew? You knew the AI could use Nick to talk?" he demanded. "Oh, come on, Joni. Give him the benefit of the doubt," Thunra interjected. "The AI used Nick's body to fight before. Why wouldn't it be able to use his mouth to talk? Common sense." "Actually, Thunra, we did know," Nash said sheepishly. 10 talked to us after the fight with the altered human." "Oh, how come you didn't say nothing?" "We didn't quite get the chance, if you'll recall," I said with a grin. "And after that interaction, we thought it best to keep it between us. Joni, step aside, please. I need to ask 10 something before Nick wakes up." Joni looked offended, but moved so that I could kneel down. He muttered a curse under his breath and crossed his arms. 10, can you hear me?" I asked. "Yes," Nick's voice said. "How is Nick doing?" "He's stable. Joni's healing was very helpful. He'll be waking up soon." "Good," I nodded. "Now then, why didn't you take control of his body like you did in the dungeon?" I caught 3 surprised expressions in my peripheral vision. I tried, Ten said in a whining tone that surprised me. He stopped me. I didn't even know he could do that. How? I asked. I do not know. He shouldn't have been able to. If that attack had been a little bit stronger or a millimeter to the left, we'd have died. Did you try to take control before he cast Wind Spear or after? Nash asked. Before, it took half a second to fully detail the beast once I had a clear view of it, and I determined that Nick would not have been able to defeat it. I attempted to gain control, but was unable to. He simply didn't go under, Ten explained. That's the second time I've experienced panic. Not enjoyable. Don't mean to be mean, buddy, but it's his body, Thunra interjected. Can't expect him to be willing to just hand it over at the drop of a hat. We could have died, Ten said softly. He's waking up now. Goodbye. We stared in uncomfortable silence at Nick's unconscious form. He looked peaceful, like a sleeping child, an illusion that was quickly shattered when he began coughing roughly and sat up. What happened? He asked. You nearly died, dumbass, Nash immediately answered. Next time an over 20 tells you to get back, you'd better fucking listen. Hey, Matri shouted from behind us. How's Nick? He's fine, Thunra called out as Matri and Yisith ran over. We checked the perimeter, Yisith said. Looks like we're clear. They looked at the corpse of the nalim, flames flickering where its eyes used to be. A lot more of its metallic endoskeleton was showing now. I couldn't help but be a little proud. Let's get back on the road, I said. Chapter 24. High Chief Ulamak, Adventurer level, not applicable. Orc. Kirkenian. Ulamak, you old fucker. I feel like it's been years. How have you been? A dwarf, dressed head to toe in the finest fashions and walking with an exaggerated swagger that he knew annoyed those around him, strolled into my office. If I hadn't known who it was by his voice, I'd have known who it was by his ability to slip past Razon. Leoth Haln, a mer of business and a self-proclaimed double agent. A real double agent would never admit to being one, even under hours of torture. The reason for that is pretty simple. Admitting to being a spy is a surefire way to make certain that you die painfully and your family no longer has a place to live. In some nations, your family will actually face the same punishment that you do. Thankfully for Leoth, he's not actually a spy, simply an information broker and a secret messenger between the High Chiefdom of Kirkina and the Empire of Kalkuti. On occasion, he'll stumble upon a juicy bit of information while on his drunken benders and pass the word along, but he doesn't seem to favor one nation over the other. He takes some getting used to, but once you do, he's a good friend to have. Able to switch gears from serious to silly in mere moments, great to unwind with, and despite his annoying demeanor, he's somehow pleasant to be around. An enigma, to be sure. It's only been months, Leoth, but I've been in good health. How about yourself? I replied with a grin. Ha, I see you've been counting the days then. I couldn't be better, he said, grabbing a seat. Met myself a sexy little elfie who's been keeping me entertained the last few days. About fucking time, too. I'd been on a desert-level dry spell. How's business? I interrupted, not wanting to hear about his debauchery. Straight to it then, he said with a measure of disappointment. Well, business has been right fucking dark as of late. Good, but dark. The Drow are definitely planning an attack, and there's something shitty about it. Shitty? I asked. Yes, absolutely shitty. Stinks to High Haven, it does. The last few times they've attacked, it's been unorganized and just generally amateurish. Their entire fucking strategy was to give a bunch of bastards sharpened sticks and shove them at the enemy. Yes, I recall, I said, the ill-conceived strategies of the inbred bastard king. What's different this time? They've got God's damned formations. I narrowed my eyes at the dwarf. Has something happened to the inbred bastard? The death of Yim Lofin would be disastrous for everyone neighboring the Drow. His incompetence and habitual political executions had kept the bloodthirsty culture of the Night Kingdom in check for half a century. The only things he's really good at is staying in power and killing those smart enough to help him be an effective king. He's uncannily good at the latter, almost as if he's deliberately trying. His family shrub was confusing to the point of being legendary. He is a third-generation royal, and I use that term loosely, whose grandparents were two sets of identical twins that had 2 children, who then brought Lofin into this world, committing adultery in the process. Each and every one of these individuals had inbreeding in their direct lineage as well. Thankfully, Lofin was an only child, so the inbreeding stopped with him. Not that I've heard of, and that kind of news would leave a pretty big splash. Hell, there's bets on whether or not Lofin's immortal. How he's avoided what must be an entire fucking army of assassins at this point is beyond the ken of mortals. Regardless, someone else is definitely in charge this time around. Someone the shithead can't bully into being stupid. Any ideas on who that could possibly be? Nope, but whoever it is definitely has a pair, so that eliminates the princes. Lofin's 3 sons were smarter than their father, but deathly afraid of him. That's only natural, considering that he's had a total of 7 children. Nothing will make you scared of your father more than watching him publicly execute your older brothers and sisters. Their upbringing by the inbred bastard king had turned them into cowards. Unfortunately, intelligent cowards turn into very dangerous rulers, so only the drow were hoping for Lofin to die. Damn, sounds like this fight with the drow is going to have to be taken seriously, I said, leaning back in my seat. Sure as shit, Lyeth said with a sympathetic smile. Want a drink to take your mind off it? He pulled out a flask and shook it. This particular flask was enchanted with a spell that caused it to refill itself with a very strong alcohol called tak, a cursed thing responsible for many forgotten nights and awkward mornings in my youth. I'm not about to go on a drunken bender when it's just after noon, Lyeth, I laughed. Plus, I've got an appointment soon. Oh, an appointment that you don't want to blow off. Do tell. Well, have you heard any rumors about a human? You're pulling my sack, the thing they pulled out of a fucking dungeon in Nullava. That's the one, I grinned. It's registered as an adventurer and everything, so I've got an extra special job for it. It's on its way here right now. Well, fuck me running. Don't suppose you'd let an old pal sit in all quiet like… Come on, don't be like that. This might be my only chance to see it. Be a fucking pal, Ulamak. I guess I could be convinced to let you stay. I rubbed my chin theatrically. If you help convince Emperor Jack to accept my proposal… Eh? You trying to get married to Jack? God's damn it, no. My proposal regarding that thrice-cursed mine. He wants to send his boys to mine it out for a steep cut of the ore. I want him to teach my boys how to mine more efficiently while giving him a more reasonable cut of the ore. Ah shit, had me all excited there for a second. Of course it's about that fucking mine though, Lyeth deflated. You know he's just about obsessed with the fucking thing. It'll be a hard sell, but he owes me some pretty big favors. I'll give it my best shot. That's all I can ask, I said. Fine, you are permitted to stay. As my old friend grinned in response to my decision, Rezun entered the room. Ah, perfect timing, I smiled. What is it? Your appointment has arrived, he said, eyeing Lyeth warily. He's going to be sitting in… Of course, Rezun sighed. The human has arrived along with his adoptive brothers and the over-20s. The over-20s have been paid out, and Ysith awaits debriefing. Nullava has also sent a messenger for another matter. Lyeth's eyebrow raised, and I smiled slyly. Of course, he wouldn't have heard anything about that. A living thing coming out of a dungeon is national news that travels like wildfire, but a strong monster within a dungeon is business as usual. Send them in, I ordered. I'll meet with the messenger afterwards. Yes, High Chief, Rezun said, and left the room. Lyeth didn't even get the chance to interrogate me before Rezun returned, accompanied by Ysith, 2 other orcs, and a strange pale-looking creature with dark hair and round ears. I quickly surmised that this must be the human. They stood next to each other in front of my desk, and Rezun adopted a very formal pose. I braced myself for what was coming. High Chief Ulamak, son of Grashknor the Giant, savior of Kirkena, slayer of dragons, decimator of drow, conqueror of the Dragon's Jaw giants, blood ally of Bolisir, dear friend of the Empire of Kalkuti, and High Commander of the Kirkena Adventurers Guild, I present to you Ysith Mulok, champion of Melrune, Nash and Yulk Alta of Clan Alta, and Nick Smith of Clan Alta. And so you have, I replied. You may continue your duties. Thank you, High Chief, Rezun said with a bow and left the room. I gazed at my visitors. The 3 orcs were very well behaved, standing straight and keeping their eyes trained just above my head. Their parents taught them well. I turned my gaze to the human, who was also standing straight but staring directly into my eyes, as if it were my equal. This surprised me for a moment. "You must be Nick Smith, adopted into Clan Alta," I said. "Yes, sir." "Well, Nick Smith, you must not have high chiefs where you're from. I say this because it is remarkably rude to look one in the eye." I smiled slightly. "Unless, of course, you've known them for quite a long time. Have we met before?" "No, sir." Its eyes left mine. "Apologies, sir." "No apologies necessary as long as corrections are made. Thank you for observing our customs," I said. "Now, Yisith, go ahead with your report." "Yes, High Chief," Yisith said. She began explaining the events of their mission, and I struggled to keep a stoic expression. A lost language, artificially intelligent machines fused with flesh, the human fighting the monster while the over-20s struggled. The fact that it wasn't actually the human fighting, the threats made by Clan Alta in regards to the human's well-being. And finally, the fact that the monster in the dungeon was a horrifically altered human. "By Bibby's balls," Lyeth muttered under his breath once the report concluded. "Indeed," I replied. "Thank you, Yisith. You may go." Yisith nodded, turned, and left the room. I looked at my remaining guests. Nick's face had the appearance of someone who had just received startling information but was trying to hide their concern. Yulk and Nash looked completely unperturbed. "Nash, Yulk," I began, "you really shouldn't be throwing your clan's weight around like that. You and I both know that the decision to avenge you would have been a controversial one, to say the least." "Yes, High Chief," Yulk said, "but if I may say something in our defense." I tried not to grin. "Go right ahead." "We weren't left with much choice. On our honor, we would have had to defend the boy against 4 over-20s. At least that's what we thought at the time." Yulk's cheeks twitched as he tried not to grin. "If they had killed us, which they likely would have, our mother would have called for their blood. I'm led to believe you personally know Yilda Alta." I couldn't help but wince at the mention of flesh-carver Yilda. Her spite is that of legends, and resisting her will is tantamount to trying to tell a waterfall to stop pouring. It was incredibly like her to randomly adopt a completely unknown creature that was discovered in a dungeon. "Yes, of course. She's done a lot for this chiefdom," I said. "Well then, it's a good thing you warned the adventurers off, I suppose." "Yilda Alta. Haven't seen her in years." "How's she been, boys?" Lyeth asked. "She's been well," Nash answered, "though she wanted me to tell you, High Chief, that she is displeased about the sudden summons of her sons, and she feels that she should get some time to spend with her boys in her golden years." "Oh, please," I laughed. "She's probably thrilled to be having you follow in your father's footsteps, though I suppose I should make sparing use of you, just in case she comes at me with a slipper." The 2 orcs were close to breaking down with laughter, and the human actually smiled. "Find a place to sit. I've got a mission for you," I said, pointing at the pile of cushions. The 3 of them grabbed a cushion, sat down, and looked at me expectantly. I couldn't help but smile when I noticed that Nick was still avoiding eye contact. It's a subtle shift from formal to informal, to be sure. "You can look at me now, Nick. When I offer you a seat, things become a lot less formal," I explained. "Oh, right," the boy stammered. "High Chief, I don't mean to be rude, but we do have our own mission to think of," Yul said. "Oh," I asked. "What would that be?" "We need to discover as much about Nick as possible. The language on the altar that Hisith mentioned is likely Dracon. If we're to know what it says, we need to find a scholar who can read it." "Well, what a coincidence," I grinned. Chapter 25. High Chief Ulamak. Adventurer level, not applicable, orc, Mtatuai. Kirkenian. "Well, what a coincidence," I grinned. The 3 looked at me curiously, and Liath raised an eyebrow. "The most likely place to find someone who can read Draken would be the kingdom of Bolisir." "And that's exactly where I need you to go," I explained. "Bolisir, the elves?" Liath asked. "Yes, I need to send a request for reinforcements," I said. I had been worried that it would be seen as premature, but from what you just told me about the drow, it's best to act with haste. If you wanted reinforcements, why not send a messenger to Kalkuti as well? Because if I ask for troops from Regent Oakmore, He has to supply them, I replied. Part of our blood pact includes a mutual defense treaty. While we have close relations with the Empire of Calcuti, Emperor Jack is not honor-bound to our defense. With everything that's been happening over that damned mine, I'm certain he'll require a game of 50 messengers before sending aid. With respect, that's fucking nah shit, Lyeth said. You and Jack may have your issues, but the people of Calcuti would have his head on a spike if it got out he didn't send troops to your defense. I looked at the dwarf incredulously. He met my stare and held it stubbornly, quite confident that he was correct. It's true that our people are close friends, even living among one another near the border. But could they possibly be close enough to rebel against their emperor for the sake of my people? I broke my gaze and rubbed my chin thoughtfully. All right, I finally said. I'll have you talk to Emperor Jack for me. Wait, Shit, fine, fair enough, you got me. I grinned at the dwarf and turned back to the other three. Yulk was the only one who didn't look confused. Nick was doing a better job of hiding his confusion than Nash was, but that's probably because he has absolutely no idea what any of us are talking about. It's not particularly important that they understand the scope of this mission, but I suppose a little history lesson is in order. We have a bad history with the Kingdom of Night. Their king is a long-lived, inbred bastard known as Yim Lofin. His family has ruled ever since the Drow won control of the region from the vampires, and every once in a while they try to conquer their neighbors. It's usually just a matter of fighting off a bunch of conscripted peasants until they run out of blood to spill. But it seems this time around things are going to be a little different. Nick looked concerned, and he raised his hand unexpectedly. I stared at him, mouth agape, trying to figure out what the hell he was doing. Nash turned to look at the boy and was also surprised and confused. It took the human a second to realize the source of our confusion, and he slowly put his hand down and cleared his throat. Sorry, there's vampires? Like bloodsuckers that turn other people into vampires? He asked. Burn up in the sun, afraid of garlic and holy symbols. Yes, I mean, no, I stammered. There are vampires, and they do drink blood, but most aren't harmed by the sun, and none of them are harmed by holy symbols. I don't know what garlic is, so they might be afraid of it. Can you kill them by driving a stake through their heart? He asked. I don't know how you would even begin to shove a stake through someone's heart. But no, they're able to quickly regenerate. You need to inhibit their movement by removing their head and then incinerate them, I answered. Easier said than done, though. They're incredibly fast and strong. Some of them can turn people into vampires too, Lyeth added. You forgot that bit. I looked at him and he grinned at me. He was enjoying how thrown off I was by this interruption. I cleared my throat. Well, that's enough about the vampires. They're hardly relevant. It's not as if they're going to be attacking alongside the Drow. I trailed off. Someone who wouldn't care about Lofin's opinions and want to conquer new lands that he would have difficulty controlling. Could the vampires be making a power play in the Night Kingdom? I looked at Lyeth, and his expression told me he had caught on to my line of thinking. Lofin's newest general might be a vampire. But how? Listen, I said, grabbing a letter from my desk. Your mission is to get to the Kingdom of Bolisir as fast as possible and deliver this letter to Regent Oakmore. You'll have to take the main road. The adventurer's path has been blocked by a rock slide, and we're having difficulty getting it cleared. Once you deliver the letter, you're free from your obligations to me, and may return for your payment at your convenience. What's the pay going to be? Yulk asked. 3 gold each, 1 paid up front for travel costs, I replied. See raison for that? Lyeth let out a low whistle. That's a lot of money for delivering a message. I'll need to raise my rates. Don't you dare, I growled playfully. I'm paying them extra because I'm being selfish in giving them this job. Now, you 3, do you understand the task? Yes, High Chief, they said in unison. Good here, I said, handing the letter to Yulk. This should go without saying, but don't open it. If you break the seal, Regent Oakmore might be able to squirm out of his obligations. Not that he would, but it's better not to tempt fate. Understood, the sorcerer said, putting the letter in his robe. I wanted to have a longer conversation, but something has come up, I explained. Come see me after you finish your task and collect your payment. I waved at them to go, and they did. Once the door closed, I turned to my dwarven confidant. Do you think the reason that the drow have suddenly become organized is due to a vampire? I asked. I mean, it makes sense, but at the same time it really fucking doesn't, he answered. Drow can't become vampires, right? That's how they were able to boot the suckers out in the first place, isn't it? Well, a vampire can't convert a drow, but what happens if they were to breed? Oof. A half-drow, half-vamp would be a weak little thing, not exactly the kind of strength that would inspire a military. No, but a weakling would be the exact type of drow that King Lofin would hand-pick to lead his armies. He doesn't like strong generals because they become a threat to his dominance, I pointed out. Shit. If he didn't know it was a vampire and it was born to nobility, it would be a shoo-in. So what? We've got an imminent vampiric coup in the Night Kingdom? No, they'd need a place to gather their strength before making a move against Lofin. Preferably somewhere that the king would have difficulty exerting influence over, and a place with plenty of potential vampire spawn. Like the High Chiefdom of Kirkina, for instance. Why would they go about it in such a weird way, though? Wouldn't it make more sense to just start turning farmers on their borders? No. If you're a vampire and you want to create enough vampires to make an army, you need control over the populace. You would need to be a noble, king, governor, or a conquering general, I said. I need you to go to Emperor Jack and let him know about this possibility and request his aid. Oh, and don't forget about that damned mine. Of course, Lyeth laughed as he stood up. I'll get his ass in gear one way or another. See you later. Have a good journey. As Lyeth left my office, Rezun entered. I raised my eyebrow at him. What is it? I asked. The messenger that arrived with the human, he explained. Do you want me to send him in? Another Nulavan messenger, eh? I asked. What does he want? I'm sure he can tell you that himself, High Chief. Raisin treated me to a withering glare. I chuckled. All right. Send him in. Raisin professionally rolled his eyes at my antics and left the room, soon returning with the messenger in question. High Chief Ulamak, son of Grashnor the Guy, he began. Enough, I interrupted. What is it, messenger? Raisin looked annoyed as the messenger straightened and stared above my head. He took a moment to gather his nerve. High Chief Ulamak, Chief Gluhern of Nulava, would like to request that Nulava be formally recognized as a village. It now meets the population and commerce requirements. It wasn't already, I jokingly asked. No, High Chief, Raisin said flatly, though Chief Gluhern's been doing his best to have it considered as such. However, at the moment, it is considered a settlement and isn't eligible for the benefits of being a village. Well, it's not exactly open to attack, so they must be after the business benefits. I doubt they'd say no to a garrison of troops, High Chief. True enough, I sighed. Of course, they wouldn't say no to a garrison. The soldiers would be getting money from Kirkena and spending it in Nulava. A drop in the bucket for us, but one hell of a boon for an up-and-coming village. Nulava had already grown pretty rapidly, and becoming a village would likely make it grow even faster. Gluhern's done a hell of a job. Fine, return to Chief Gluhern and tell him Nulava is now a village, I said. Let him know the garrison will have to wait until the drow are dealt with. Yes, High Chief. Raisin guided the messenger out of my office, and I was once again left alone with my thoughts and my mountain of paperwork. The human had looked interesting, shaped like a short elf, but it was missing the tinge of green in its skin and eyes, and its ears were round. Those eyes were strange, piercing and blue, a stark contrast to its black hair, a shade of blue I'd never seen in eyes before. It's obvious that it's from a foreign land. Perhaps I'll be able to ask it about that upon its return. I put the human from my mind and set about the task of filling out the paperwork that surrounded me. All of it was boring. Things like requisition forms that I really should be delegating, approvals and denials for proposals, and tax stuff. There were some seemingly exciting papers like the disposition of soldiers and training permissions and things of that nature. Unfortunately, these only sound exciting until you have to be the one to fill them out. It was rare that I could simply sign something and be done with it. I yawned as I set a large stack of papers I'd just completed in my done pile. I smiled in satisfaction at the dent I had made, and Raisin entered the room, holding a stack twice the size of the one I'd just completed. What the hell is this? I demanded as he set the stack on my to-be-done pile. These are the forms to officially make Nullava a village, he replied. There's the recognition forms, tax forms, requests for updates to the various maps of the High Chiefdom, and of course congratulatory letters to the village leaders. So what you're saying is that I made more work for myself by being benevolent to the people of Nullava. Yes, High Chief, Rezun said with a malicious smile. No good deed goes unpunished. Damn it. Chapter 26. Nick Smith, Adventurer Level 5, Human American. Should we ask Imlaw if he can take us? I asked my brothers. Nash rubbed his neck and Yulk tapped his chin as if he was thinking. We walked along the busy streets of Kirkena in silence for a few moments. I don't know. He did say he wanted to spend more time with his family, Nash said. We might be better off finding a caravan that's already going to Bolisir and just tagging along. Before we see to transportation, we should see if we can get your weapons and armor repaired, Yulk added. If I recall correctly, there are a couple of enchanters that might be able to do it quickly. Enchanters, not a smith? I asked. Enchanters use magic to mend weapons and armor, he explained. It's a fairly quick process compared to doing it manually. Costs more, though, Nash grumbled. It's not that much more expensive, Yulk argued. Plus, it's the fastest way to get your weapons fixed. Come on. Yulk led us through the city in search of an enchanter. We passed by several stalls selling various foods and trinkets, buildings advertising various goods and services, and alleyways that were definitely shady gathering spots. Finally, we came to a part of the city that smelled like hot metal. The normal sound of people talking was replaced by the ringing of hammers striking steel and the occasional hiss of rapidly cooling heat. Let's see. Yulk looked around. Ah, there. An enchanter. He pointed to a brick building with a sign hanging off the side of it that had some writing and a drawing of a star above an anvil. As we approached the building, I wondered if Ten knew about enchantments. Hey, Ten. No, it interrupted me. What do you mean, no? I thought angrily. You don't get to ask me questions until you answer mine. How did you stop me from taking control? Ten matched my anger. First of all, I don't know. Second of all, even if I did know, I still wouldn't tell you, because then you'd find a way around what I did and take control of my body away from me again. This conversation had been happening intermittently ever since I woke up after that battle. I don't really remember what I did. All I remember is suddenly feeling dizzy and thinking to myself that I can't let Ten take control. Can't really remember much after that, probably a consequence of being thrown like a rag doll. The monster had lashed out with just one of its claws, as if on instinct. If it hadn't been for my cuirass, we could have died. We would have died if it weren't for your companions, Ten said. Even if the monster had left you alone after it struck you, I wouldn't have been able to repair that damage without Joni's healing spells. I don't want to die, Nick. Well, neither do I, but I'm not going to get any stronger if you keep taking control of my body at the first sign of trouble. It's my job to keep us alive, I retorted, not yours. That is simply not true. My mandate is to keep you alive and aid your growth. Obviously, that means letting you fight things you can beat, and even things that are challenging for you to beat. So I won't be taking over your body as often as you're implying. But you cannot grow if you're dead. So when we run into an enemy that you cannot beat on your own, it only makes sense for me to take over and help you beat it. That's the whole reason I have the ability to take control in the first place. Yeah, well, you don't have the ability to take control anymore, so that throws that theory out of the window. And by refusing to answer my questions, you're not fulfilling your mandate of aiding my growth either. As I followed Yulk into the building, I felt a sharp sting behind my eyes that told me I won the argument. Worth it. Behind the counter was a tall blonde man with shining green eyes. I almost thought he was human, but his ears were unnaturally pointed, just like everyone else I'd seen so far. An elf, probably. Hello, potential customers. I am Erias. How can I help you today? He asked. We've got some weaponry that needs rapid repair, Yulk answered. A sword and an axe. I'd rather have the other swords repaired than the axe, Nash said. Or maybe all three, if the price is right. Well, let's have a look at the weapons then, the elf chuckled. Nash pulled his weapons out and set them on the counter, and I followed suit. adding my cuirass that had a fairly large hole in it. Arias glanced at the items and then at us. Now that I was closer, he looked a lot less human. His skin had a slight green tint, and he didn't have a single pointed tooth in his mouth. It kind of reminded me of videos about the uncanny valley phenomena. He raised an eyebrow as he looked me over. His eyes lingered over my ears and then met mine. "That's a pretty traumatic injury, brother," Arias said. "I'm not an elf," I replied. "I'm a human." A what?" he asked. "A paying customer," Yulk interrupted with a smile. "Oh, right, good point," the elf laughed nervously. "All right, let's have a look here." Arias picked up the remains of each weapon and examined them thoroughly, one after the other. Finally, he looked over my armor and nodded solemnly to himself. "Well, the good news is that I can repair them," Arias said, setting the armor back onto the counter. "The bad news is that it's going to cost 98 silver and take a few hours." "Each?" Nash asked suspiciously. The elf laughed. "No, total. The elven blades are the biggest chunk of that, coming in at 30 silver each. The cutlass I can do for 19. The flesh render I can do for 10, though you'd save a lot of money on that by just letting me shave it down a bit and redo the serration. The armor's the cheapest because it's going to be the easiest. Hell, it'll do most of the work itself." "What do you mean?" I asked. "The enchantment on it is self-repair. Given enough time, it fixes itself. All I've got to do is rush it a bit and you're good." "How long would it take to shave the axe?" Nash asked. "No, I've got a backlog on the smithing. It would be at least 2 days." "Damn, gotta have it done today." "Well, 98 silver will see them all done in about 2 hours." "Why are the elven blades so expensive?" I asked. All three of them looked at me with raised eyebrows, as if I had asked why jerky was chewy. I couldn't help but deflate a bit under their gaze. Because the crystalline structure of elvish forgecraft is intricate. Well, proper elvish forgecraft at least. A knockoff has the same kind of steel you'd find from a dwarven journeyman. Arias laughed. These, though, were smithed by a proper grandmaster with good old-fashioned magicite. "Magicite?" I asked. Yes, magicite. It's a somewhat rare metal that's notoriously fickle to work with. Adamantium and mithrilite have similar properties, but adamantium requires a much higher temperature, and mithrilite requires actual spellcraft to work with. Magicite, though, is very durable, flexible, and holds a good magic charge, but you have to have the heat on it just right, or it becomes more fragile than glass. When alloyed with steel, it becomes even more durable, he explained. "I wouldn't want to meet a monster who could break these blades." "Yeah, neither did we," Yulk chuckled. "You got change for a gold?" "Sure do." "I'll cover it," Nash said. "You hold on to yours. Buy a book to read for the trip or something." He put his gold coin on the counter, and the elf swapped it with 2 silver coins. "Pleasure doing business with you. Feel free to have a look around. My apprentice will be coming out front if you want to buy something." Arias smiled wide, demonstrating oddly flat teeth. "Or you can just check back in a couple of hours." "We'll check back. We have to arrange transport to Bolisir." "Bolisir? You may want to check with the gnome next door. He's going to be shipping some items to Bolisir for me," the elf said. "Let me guess. The gnome's name is Imlaw?" I asked with a chuckle. "Well, yes, but that's not a particularly clever guess. A lot of gnomes are named Imlaw." "Huh?" "It's the most common gnomish name, and it came from Imlawkrav," Yulk interjected, "a legendary gnomish sorcerer. He invented several spells and defeated several powerful enemies." "Yep," Arias said. "Anyways, this gnome's name is Imlaw Tula." I laughed. "I guessed right. He's the one who brought us here. We were thinking he was going to be spending time with his family." "Oh?" Arias asked. His travels must have been unusually hectic. Regardless, this delivery was agreed upon before he left for the dungeon settlement. It should net him enough to hire someone else to drive the cart, though. Then he'll be able to stay home more often. Telena will be thrilled. At first. The other 3 chuckled, but I didn't get the joke. Instead, something had caught my eye. A glass display that contained a singular item that shouldn't be there. It was a helmet, made of what looked to be bronze or brass. The reason it shouldn't be here is because I've seen it before. Dozens of times in dozens of different places, movies, shows, video games, comic books, even online videos of cosplayers. It was a Spartan helmet. There was no mistaking the iconic design. Red bristles that stuck straight up adorned the crown of the helm, traveling down the back and culminating in a ponytail. The eye holes were rounder than I remember them being, but the nose guard without a mouth covering left little doubt as to where the design had come from. As I looked into the face of the helm, I felt a pull. I want nothing more than to put it on and fight my way to my goals. It will protect me as I cleave through my enemies on my way back to Cass. The eyes on the helmet seemed to burn into my own, and for a moment I imagined her playfully taking the helmet off of me and kissing me. I was happy. She was happy, and the helmet was happy for us. A tear ran from one of my eyes. "Careful," Arias said, snapping me out of it. I realized that I had been clenching my fist so hard my nails had dug into my skin. I took a deep breath and let it out with a sigh. I wiped my face and looked at the elf. "How much?" I asked. "You sure?" "Yes." "Wait," Nash said. "What's going on?" "It would appear that Ares has chosen a new champion," Arias answered. Ares? The question hung in my throat. "Yes, that's the helmet's name, named after a god of war from another world, according to the Aniels that brought it to this one. It chooses a champion and protects them until they pick a fight they cannot win. Then it escorts their soul to the afterlife and waits for another champion," he explained. "At least that's how the legends go. In practice, it's a heavily enchanted helmet that won't activate its enchantments for just anyone. I keep it around because I like how it looks, and it's an interesting story to tell potential customers." Ares, the ancient Greek god of war and courage. How did the Aniels know about that? Have they been to my world? Or maybe the whole thing is made up. But who here would know of Ares? Another human, maybe? "What kind of enchantments does it have?" Yulk asked, oblivious to my concerns. "It has basic protection against the elements, piercing resistance, and a kinetic intensifier in its metal. The brush has a cleanliness enhancer and another, more unique enchantment. If the Aniels really did bring the helmet here, were they also the ones that enchanted it? Or did it come from another version of my world, one with magic and stuff? A kinetic intensifier in a helmet. You don't usually see those on anything other than hammers," Nash commented. "What's the unique enchantment do?" Yulk asked. "I'm not 100% sure. It's conditional, and the script is confusing. I assume that it will only take effect if worn by someone that it chooses, but I can't tell you exactly what will happen, just that it has something to do with its existence." Arias shrugged. "Do you know where we can find Eniels?" I asked. The three looked at me curiously. It occurred to me that my question had come out of nowhere to them. I don't know," Arias stammered. "They haven't left Haven since the Cataclysm Wars, I think, and nobody knows how to get to Haven." "Why do you ask?" Yulk asked. "The Aniels might know of my home and how I can get back." "Really?" Nash raised an eyebrow. "Fine then. How much for the helmet?" Well, normally it wouldn't be for sale, but, well," Arias pursed his lips thoughtfully. "I'll let it go for 50 silver if the human puts it on here. I'd love to see what the unique enchantment does." "Deal," I said. Chapter 27. Imlortula. Adventurer level not applicable. Gnome, Kirkenian. "So you don't have enough to hire a driver for this delivery? It has to be you?" Telena asked, bouncing our baby boy, Igran, on her arm. The boy was named after my wife's father, who had been my uncle's best friend and taught me everything he knew about being a merchant. His lessons were how Telena and I met. She's the reason I am a firm believer in love at first sight. Her father was less than thrilled to hear about our courtship at first, but he came around and endorsed our wedding. He never hesitated to offer aid to us as our family grew, right up until his death just a week before Igran was born. I wrapped my arms around my wife and son and squeezed them tight. Igran, the little scamp, grabbed my ear and tried to put it in his mouth. "No, I could hire a driver, but I wouldn't be able to hire guards for them." I smiled sadly as I twisted my ear out of the boy's grasp. "That wouldn't be fair, especially with all that's going on recently." All that's going on recently. What a dull way to describe all the happenings in recent times. Rumor has it that the drow are planning to start attacking again. There's been a rock slide or something that shut down the adventurer's path to Bolisir, and there's been reports of disappearances on the civilian path. I'm definitely going to need to hire guards. But what if you run into another Nahalim? My darling, I'd rather pay guards and run into a Nahalim myself than hire an unguarded driver and have them run into it for me. I kissed her cheek and put a hand on her shoulder. I'll make sure to hire the toughest of guards, and this will be the last time I have to do a delivery myself. The original plan had been to hire both a driver and guards for this job. If the giant rats hadn't killed my H-Narses and destroyed everything but the metal I was transporting, I'd have been able to stay home with my family and let business take care of itself for a bit. Maybe even indefinitely. I'm glad that I hadn't had this conversation with Telena last time. Fate would have made a liar of me. It had better be. I don't know if I can take many more sleepless nights. I thought it was bad just having to worry about Junior, but at least he's an actual adventurer, she sighed. Baba Badla, Igran added, matching his mother's serious expression. I'm sorry, my sweet. At least I won't be fighting any of the monsters, though. I'm not as brave as our son, I smiled and handed Igran his teething toy. As a proper coward, it simply wouldn't do to be charging headlong into danger. So don't worry too much, okay? A bell rang that indicated that the shop in front of our house had a visitor, hopefully a customer. I kissed my wife's forehead and patted her free arm. It'll be fine, I said. I hope so. I smiled at her and went to see to our potential customers. I walked through the warehouse entrance, sighing as I looked upon all the empty shelves. The ones that did contain goods weren't exactly full either. That would change soon. Just one more delivery and things would get back on track. I walked through a flap that led into my shop and paused as I saw who my customers were. Hi, in-law. Nick grinned at me with his oddly shaped teeth. Hello, Nick, I said. I'm happy you were able to find my little shop. Did you come to tell me how things went with the High Chief? In a way, Yulk chuckled, browsing my written goods. We need a ride to Bolisir, Nash grunted, his arms crossed. The elf next door said you were going there to make a delivery for him. Arius? Well, yes, I'm going to be making a delivery for him. Going to be a tight fit if I have to hire more guards, though, I said with a sly grin. I don't mind working for transportation. How much are you paying? Will 50 copper each do the trick? I think 75 would be more appropriate. You seem to be a monster magnet. Come now, brother, Yulk interjected. It simply cannot be his fault that every time we've seen him, we've also seen monsters. It's also a boon that we're getting paid to travel to where we need to go. How about 60? I asked. Nash sighed and proceeded to perform several theatrics that I'd seen dozens of times before. Rubbing his chin, scratching his neck, tapping his foot, all the while pretending to think about the deal I just offered. Of course, he was actually hoping that I'd sweeten the deal a bit. Might as well, it'll still be less expensive than hiring guards from the guild. Plus meals, I added. Within reason, of course. 3 hots a day. 1 hot, 2 cold. You prefer hot dinner or breakfast? Dinner. All right, 60 copper each, and you buy the jerky and stew, Nash said, offering a hand. Deal, I shook his hand. Nah, could I get some meals that have a mixture of meat and veg in them? Nick asked. Stew has proso chunks in it, Nash answered. That's a vegetable, technically. It's a starchy tuber, Yulk added. It's known to help with cramping if prepared properly. Putting it in a stew isn't one of the ways to prepare it as an anti-cramping tonic, though. I remember catching in passing that Nick was able to eat both meat and vegetables, but I had been busy at the time and hadn't given it much thought. The shape of his teeth suddenly came to mind, and it all clicked into place. I can help with this. I usually bring extra fruit and veg bars, I said. I'll share the excess with you. Thanks, Nick said with another grin. Yulk walked over to my counter and set down a well-worn tome that had been collecting dust on my shelf for a few months. I raised my eyebrow at him. How much for this one? He asked. The Musings of Gralv? You can take it, I chuckled. If it weren't for you, I'd say there isn't a soul in this city that cares anything about an imp's opinion on the Fae. A what? Nick asked. An imp, Yulk explained. A small, typically nomadic race that has a bad reputation. My interest is less in the subject matter of the book and more in the fact that an imp wrote it. They aren't known to be fond of writing. Nothing makes that more apparent than the musings of Gralv, I laughed. Why do they have a bad reputation? Because they've got plenty of bad apples they don't bother sorting out, Nash answered the boy with a grunt. They'll temporarily settle near a village or town, and once there's been a few thefts, rapes and murders they run, instead of letting the culprit face justice. It can't be all of them, though, Nick argued. Right. Maybe not, Yulk said. You rarely see them in these parts, yet even we've heard the stories, though. Unfortunately, that means there's likely some truth to them. Yulk put the book in his pack, settled his staff in the nook of his arm, and brushed the dust from his hands. The conversation got me thinking about the reputation that gnomes used to have in these parts. I grew up with people saying that gnomes were willing to sell their children for a copper if they needed one to screw someone over. That, of course, isn't true for most gnomes. And for every gnome that it is true for, there's an elf, orc, and dwarf that it's also true for. What gave rise to this generalization was that most of the gnomes in Kirkinia were merchants of some variety. The reason for that is because most of the gnomes here come from migrants, and being a merchant was the best way for an immigrant to make a living. There's plenty of gnomes in Kalkuti that aren't merchants, and it's almost impossible to find a gnomish merchant in Hinkren. The unfortunate reality of this generalization is that people automatically assume that gnomes are good at business and are more willing to trust gnomes that they shouldn't trust when it comes to matters of business. A few years ago, one of the great chiefs appointed a gnome as treasurer. This particular gnome was a blowhard who didn't have a head for any sort of business, let alone civic economics. The gnome in question gravely disrupted the economy of the city. It got so bad that he and several other innocent gnomes were lynched before the great chief's guards were able to put a stop to things. The mob of angry Mer genuinely believed that all of the gnomes in the city, who were also negatively impacted by the bad economy, were somehow involved in a conspiracy to bring the city down. Even after everything settled down, there were attacks on caravans and businesses that were owned by gnomes for years afterward. It must be terrible to live in a place where your neighbors hate you through no fault of your own. I'd like to believe that Kirkina's different, but when are you going to be ready to leave? Nash asked. The carts are all packed up, but I need to pick up some provisions from the Adventurers Guild, I answered. Just as well, we should get Nick's level retested, Yulk said. Really? Why? Nick asked. Because you learned some new skills in our adventures thus far, Yulk grinned. Plus, I'm curious as to how 10 impacts your level. I'm willing to bet you're at least level 6. No way. Sure, he learned a couple of skills. But that doesn't mean he went up a level, Nash said, shaking his head. Right, I interrupted. Well, the carts are out back. Go ahead and load up. I'll be with you shortly. The three nodded and left out of the front of the shop, and I exited through the back flap back into the warehouse. As I entered my home, my wife looked up at me from our kitchen table. She must have set Igran down to play in his room. Customers? She asked. Nope, I answered. Those were the people that saved my butt when I was on the road. Turns out they also need to go to Bolisir. So I hired them as guards, on the cheap, of course. Telena laughed, always finding a way to save some coin. You sure this is going to turn out all right? I shrugged. It has to. I'm contractually obligated. Even if I weren't, by the time another opportunity like this came along, we'd be starving, and I'd still have to go. I know, she sighed. I'm just worried. I don't want to lose you. Telena hadn't always been like this. When I initially went on the delivery to Nulava, she had seen me off with a smile, confident in my return. Something changed when I got home days later than I should have and told her about the giant rats and the nahalim. She's been fretting over me ever since. If it were anyone else, I would be annoyed. But with Telena, I couldn't feel anything except loved. I hate to see her worried, but I'd hate it more to see her starving. I love her more than anything, and I'd give anything to see her happy and well. I'll do everything in my power to make certain that you don't, darling. I brushed her hair out of her face and kissed her. I've got to go. I know, she pulled me into a tight hug. I returned the embrace, enjoying the flowery scent of her hair and the feel of her warm breath on my chest. I silently wished that I had become someone's apprentice instead of starting my own business. Some job that would just require me to work some hours and come home to her safe and sound, making just enough to keep a roof over our heads and food in our bellies. What more do I need when I've got her by my side? Unfortunately, that was a pipe dream. I'm too old to be an apprentice now, and I don't have any non-mercantile skills that would let me start over fresh. The only way to keep my family housed, clothed, and fed is to revitalize my business. And the only way to do that is to leave Telena behind for a time and risk my life on the open road. I love you more than anything, I whispered to her. I love you more than that, she whispered back. I gave her another squeeze and kissed her again. I'll be back. Chapter 28. Nick Smith. Adventurer Level 5, Human, American. We waited for a few minutes in the back of the cart before Imlaw finally came out the back door of his house. It was an interesting building, a shop attached to the side of his house. The only door on the front I'd seen was for the shop, so maybe this is the front door of his house. That makes some sense if he normally parks his carts back here. The Nazis were tied to the carts and attached to a stake. They didn't react at all when we'd approached, but I get the feeling that if we tried to pet them, we'd regret it immediately. There was a stable next to the back of the shop, which must be where they sleep. It looked a lot better than the stables I'd seen back on Earth, like someone paid a lot of money for its construction. Imlaw untied the reins from the stake and patted each Nas on the head. "You good?" Nash asked, referring to the unexpected wait. "Yeah, saying goodbye to the missus," Imlaw answered as he climbed into the driver's seat. "She's justifiably worried about my health." "I wouldn't say justifiably," Nash chuckled. "You've got 3 tough guards to watch your back." "True enough, but as you said before, I'm somewhat of a monster magnet," Imlaw chuckled. "No matter how tough my guards are, there's a chance something might hit me from out of nowhere." "Yeah, but Yulk knows how to heal, so it'll work out." Assuming it doesn't kill him immediately, Yulk added, "Magic can heal, but it can't bring back the dead." "Well, not as they were, at any rate." "Speaking of the dead," I said, "if vampires exist, what about zombies and stuff like that?" As the cart began moving, Yulk and Nash stared at me. I suppose it hadn't occurred to them that I was ignorant of such things. Nash sighed, but Yulk grinned, likely excited by the chance to give a lecture. Shambling corpses, ghouls, and most other monsters that relate to the death of mortals are all magical beings that have been corrupted by death in one way or another. There is magic to create such fiends, but thankfully it's relatively rare and very looked down upon, Yulk explained. If Nash were to die and rise again as a zombie, I wouldn't hesitate to destroy his fetid corpse. Do you know why? Because it wouldn't be Nash anymore, I guessed. Correct, he said gleefully. Nash will have passed on to whatever awaits in the afterlife. What would then be inhabiting his corpse would be nothing more than a corrupted magical being. One that presumably I've never met and as such feel no attachment to. What sort of magical being would that be? There are too many different magical beings to classify them all, and most of them have the ability to possess dead flesh. Both fairies and the Fae, for instance, are able to do so. When a fairy possesses a corpse, it becomes a zombie. When a Fae possesses one, it becomes a ghoul. However, this doesn't mean that every zombie used to be a fairy and every ghoul used to be a Fae. What is a ghoul exactly? I asked. Where I come from, they're creatures that hang out in graveyards and eat the rotting flesh from corpses. That's almost the exact opposite of what a ghoul is here, Yulk laughed. Ghouls are mutated corpses that crave the flesh of the living like a zombie does, but are much better equipped to get it than a zombie is. Faster, smarter, and much stronger. Thankfully, they hunt solo most of the time, and do so by ambushing those who wander too far from the safety of numbers. Ghouls don't actually need to eat, so they're very patient pests, Nash added. How do you kill one? The corrupted magical being that is reanimating the corpse resides in the brain and controls its function with magic, Yulk said. As such, the only way to terminate an undead is decapitation, or to apply extreme cerebral trauma. Fire will technically work, but only because it performs the latter method of extermination. And vampires. Vampirism is a tricky one. Technically, when a mer is turned into a vampire, their magical core is merged with a corrupted magical being, and they in turn become a new type of magical being. By far and large, they retain their identity and memories, as well as the use of any and all skills they possessed while they were alive. Yulk hesitated. If Nash were to rise again as a vampire, I would hesitate to end him. Or re-end, I suppose. Why's that? Vampires don't have to be evil, Nash said. There's been tales of vampire heroes who fought alongside mortals to put an end to those who would try to destroy life as we know it. Which makes the choices that most vampires decide upon all the more tragic, Yulk added. There is a great deal of trauma that goes into becoming a vampire, and the immediate surge in power afterwards is too much for most minds to bear. Wanting others to join you in suffering is a very common trait among mortals, and vampires are in a rather unique position to accomplish exactly that. It doesn't help that shithead vamps purposefully recruit other shitheads, Nash grumbled. Societal leeches becoming literal leeches is all that is. Do you kill them by decapitating them? I asked. Nash and Yulk shared a look. I'm afraid it's not as simple as that, Yulk explained. Since they've become magical beings, they're not limited to their flesh like we are. One must bind them to their flesh through spellcraft or by divine grace and then entirely destroy their body. Decapitation will help in that regard, but the entire body must be destroyed or the head will simply grow back. Or the body will grow back from the head. They have insane regeneration abilities, especially if they've recently fed, Nash added. Even if you chop them up into little bits, they can still regrow their flesh from one of those bits. It's best to bind them, lob off their head, and incinerate the immediate area entirely. Do they actually drink people's blood? I asked. Like, can't they drink animal blood? No, they have to drink the blood of mortals. It's the only thing that will provide them sustenance. They can pretend to be mortal by eating and drinking normal food, and they pass that food in the way one would expect of a mortal. But they'll slowly starve unless they drink the blood of mortals, Yulk said. The aforementioned vampiric heroes had people willingly give them blood, usually a lover or a friend, and didn't take more than they absolutely needed. How do you lot know so much about vampires? Imlaw asked, sounding a little unnerved. It's an interesting subject, Nash replied defensively. Might have to fight one someday. Wasn't all that long ago that they ruled the Kingdom of Night, you know? A few generations now. Anyways, I learned most of what I know from the works of Imlaw the Grand's tomes on the subject. Yulk chuckled. Ah, Imlaw the Grand. Now that's an interesting subject, Imlaw said. Didn't know he knew a lot about vampires, though. Towards the end of his life, he became a little obsessed with immortality, as most magic wielders do, Yulk explained. The experiments he did on captured vampires were more than a little disturbing. Ah, I don't want to hear any more than that, Imlaw interrupted. I'd rather the mental image I have of my namesake remain unsullied, if you don't mind. I don't mind at all, Yulk chuckled. Hey Ten, are we on speaking terms again? I thought to my AI companion. What do you want? It replied curtly. Do you think that a vampire would be able to turn me into one? Definitely not. Your magical core is artificial and as such cannot be corrupted by outside influence like a natural magic core can. Your blood also has several differences from the blood of Myr, so it's not even clear whether it could be utilized as a source of sustenance by a vampire. So they wouldn't even be able to drink my blood. There isn't anything about your blood that would physically prevent them from ingesting it. It's unknown whether it would grant sustenance to a vampire, though. I suppose it would either be disgusting or a delicacy. Before I could ask Ten anything further, the cart stopped in front of a very impressive building. Its construction was primarily polished stone that had a dark grey coloration, with wooden details and pillars holding up the roof. The wood had a red tinge to it that stood out against the grey walls. Nash and Yulk respectively hopped and climbed out of the cart, with Imlaw and I soon following. As we approached the building, I noticed slight seams in the stonework, as if they had polished massive chunks of stone and stacked them on top of each other. Nash pushed open one of the massive double doors and gestured for us to enter, which we did. I nodded a thank you at him as I passed, to which he grunted. It was unclear whether he was annoyed or appreciative. I'm going to the quartermaster's dugout, Imlaw said. Meet me there if you're done first. Understood, replied Yulk. Yulk began to approach the front desk and we followed him. Nash leaned up against the counter as an elven woman wearing a long-sleeved shirt and a vest appeared from a door in the back. "Hello there, how can I help you today?" she asked with a smile. Her smile nearly faltered when she saw me, but her professionalism kicked in. It was obvious that she wanted to ask about me, but decided against it. "We would like to get his level tested," Nash gestured at me. "Certainly, just a moment." She reached under the counter and pulled out an intricately carved wooden box, which she then opened. She took a machine that looked like the one from the Nulavan Adventurers Guild and set it on the counter. A shiny black box with 6 legs made of different metals: gold, silver, copper, and I couldn't tell what the other 3 were. One was probably platinum, but the other 2 were strange. One had a deep blue coloration and the other had a light pink color to it. "Your guild card, please," she smiled. "I have his guild card right here," Yulk said as he passed her my card. He'd held onto it for me while I had my physical, and I'd forgotten to ask for it back. Just as well, it might fall out of my pocket during a fight or something. The elf plugged the card into the slot that was facing us and put her fingers into some holes on her side of the box. A bright blue light shone from the top of the box and gathered itself into a perfect square. Green light soon followed, creating a handprint as well as characters that I couldn't read on the blue square. The blue and green light hardened into something that looked a lot like stained glass. The elf removed her fingers from the box and inserted some papers where her hand had been. "Please place your hand on the handprint until you feel a slight electrical shock," she smiled. Slight electric shock, my ass. When Nima had said that to me, I'd expected something like a static shock. What actually happened was a jolt of electricity shoving its way through my hand and up my arm. I gripped my teeth and placed my hand firmly on the damned print. My hand started shaking in anticipation of the shock, but it didn't come. I took a deep breath and managed to hold my hand still, pressing it into the print. I felt a slight tingle traveling up my arm, but couldn't tell if it was electricity or just my nerves, traumatized by my previous experience. I opened my mouth to ask about it when it happened. "Fuck!" I shouted as a bolt of electricity shot out of my elbow and arced into the floor. Yulk, Nash, and the elf all leapt back as I sank to my knees, holding my now injured arm. "What the hell was that?" Nash shouted. I don't know," the elf stammered. "I've never seen it do that before." "Are you all right, Nick?" Yulk asked, leaning down to check on me. "That fucking hurt," I said as I squeezed my eyes shut to prevent tears from making an appearance. I felt something odd in my mind. It wasn't a sound, but a sort of feeling. The one you get when you're giggling maniacally. It took me a second to realize what it was. "Was that you?" I asked Ten, trying very hard to make my inner dialogue sound angry. "No, but I didn't stop it," Ten continued laughing. "Serves you right. That could have killed me." "Not at that voltage," it explained. "It wasn't even close to lethal. Painful. Absolutely. But since you want to be independent, from now on I'll just try to stop things from killing you. You can figure out how to deal with pain yourself." I was getting really tired of this, but I knew better than to blow up at it. That would just make it angrier, and it wasn't like Ten didn't have many other ways to make my life miserable. Instead, I opted for diplomacy. "Look, Ten, I'm sorry, okay? I should have talked things out with you before the fight happened." "You're damn right you should have," Ten interrupted. "I know it was frightening, and my unexpected resistance must have absolutely made it even more so," I continued. "I understand that you're just as stuck with me as I am stuck with you, and it was stubborn and foolish of me not to take that into account." "Correct. Neither of us asked for this situation, and I shouldn't treat you like you're to blame." "I'm sorry." Yulk gently grabbed my uninjured arm and pulled me to my feet. "Apology accepted." Ten said, "The reason that happened is because the stats reader takes some of your mana to determine your current skills and spells, and then returns it. However, your new incorporeal helmet is passively boosting your mana output. The excess energy was the return." "How do I keep it from doing that every time?" I asked. "You don't need to. I can stop it from happening by tightening your channels so the flow is closer to your norm. However, learning to control your mana flow better wouldn't hurt." "Are you okay?" the elf asked. Yeah, sorry about that. I got a new enchanted helmet and it increased my mana flow without my knowledge, I answered. Is the extra mana going to interfere with the results of the stats reader? I quickly asked 10. No, it only takes the mana to determine your skills and spells. The amount of mana you have is determined separately by Kuragwad through unknown means. Helmet, she asked, looking at my hair. This, Nash said as he swung his fist at my head. I didn't even get the chance to duck before Ares suddenly appeared on my head and rang like a bell as Nash's fist struck it. I reeled back and Nash sucked in a breath as he waved his now injured hand. I found my footing and tried to shake the ringing out of my head as Yulk chuckled. Serves you right, Nash, he grinned, sucker punching a seemingly defenseless child. Shame on you. It was just a demonstration of the helmet's ability to appear when its wearer is in danger. Nash massaged his hand. I'd hardly call it a sucker punch. I felt my head and found that Ares had disappeared once again. It occurred to me that I have no way to remove the helmet if it keeps disappearing on me like this. I felt a bit of panic before I realized that since I don't feel the helmet on my head until it's needed, there's really no reason for me to have to take it off. Still, I wish I had known that it would be a permanent addition when I'd first tried it on. Right, the elf said, remembering her professionalism. Well, here are the results. She handed my guild card back to me and I looked at it. Some of the characters on it had changed, but I still had no idea what it said. Yulk looked over my shoulder and let out a low whistle. I handed the card to him as Nash raised his eyebrow. What's it say? He asked. Level 10, Yulk said with an uncharacteristically deadpan tone. What? Nash shouted. No fucking way. Gotcha. Yulk started laughing. He's level 7. Gods, you should see your face. You're not funny, Nash said, utterly failing to convince our brother, who continued to laugh uproariously. 2 levels? I got a few new skills and practiced my fighting a bit, but I was under the impression that levels were hard to attain. What happened? Nash noticed my confusion. Probably something to do with 10, he said, pushing me to the side. Move over, I want to test mine. Oh, certainly, the elven lady said. Guild card, please. Nash looked at Yulk, who was doubled over with tears in his eyes. After a few seconds of this, Nash cleared his throat. While continuing to laugh, Yulk reached into his robe, produced another metal card and handed it to Nash. Nash turned back to the elf and gave her the card. 10, why did I jump up 2 levels? I asked while Nash put his hand on the handprint. The level system has a lot of difficult to account for variables. However, once I was activated, I took the liberty of optimizing your magic core, which has both made it easier for you to cast spells and increased your base mana. This, combined with the new skills you've gained, is likely the reason. I'm afraid I can't read, and my normal narrator is currently indisposed, Nash said, gesturing to Yulk, who was still hunched over, laughing. Could you tell me my level? Certainly, you're level 9, she smiled. Congratulations. Thank you so much, Nash smirked at me. Yulk coughed a bit to calm his laughing fit. Yes, congratulations, brother. 1 level closer to marrying Nima. That's, Nash said, turning a slightly darker green. Blushing? That's not the point. I was trying to point out that I learned some new skills too. I know, Yulk chuckled. Let's go see Imlaw and go get our weapons. We need to hit the road. What new skills did you learn, Nash? I asked as we walked toward the quartermaster's dugout. He turned to make eye contact with me and gave me the type of grin that can only be described as evil. Oh, you'll see. Chapter 29. Master General Kirain Yith, Adventurer level, not applicable, half-breed drow, Balushenian. Are the preparations complete, Spindly One? The crow was perched upon the helmet of my armor, and its eyes glowed a faint red as the message burned into my mind. My fury enveloped me. How dare it refer to me as Spindly? This entire plan depends entirely upon me. On the other hand, though, my plans depend upon them as well. I carefully hid my bile and rage at the disrespect as I formulated my response. The preparations are moving forward according to the schedule. I grow impatient. We grow impatient. The filth one must be destroyed, and our lands must be returned. I couldn't help but sigh. How can one live for thousands of years and still be as impatient as a whining pup? Do elder vampires regress into childhood as they age? Thinking on it, the older people seem to get the less mature they seem to act. Even members of the nobility are no exception. Perhaps maturity follows some sort of bell curve. There is nothing that can be done for your impatience, with the exception of the expert application of your own willpower. A shriek blasted in my mind that would have given me a start had I not been fully expecting it. The faint glow of the crow's eyes turned bright as they bored into mine. I met those eyes without blinking, staring down the challenge issued. The vampire controlling the crow knew there was nothing they could do against me. Soon enough, the coloration faded entirely, and I was left glaring at a very confused corvid. Crows are strange birds. In many ways, they seem to be dumber than the birds that are natural to this world, but in some certain specific ways, they're very intelligent. This crow, for instance, knew that it was out of place, but didn't make the type of fuss one would expect a wild animal to. Instead, it watched me warily, staying still and waiting for me to make the first move. It would continue to wait. I had no intention of risking a pecking by trying to pick it up. Thankfully for us both, my tent flap opened and the bird from another world took the chance to escape with gusto. General Smarn cursed as he had to crouch to avoid a collision with it. Once the bird had taken to the sky, Smarn looked at me with an obvious question in his bright orange eyes. "A crow with a message for me from a family member," I explained before he could ask. I shook a freshly unfolded missive that had been attached to the crow's left leg. The point of the missive wasn't actually communication, it was to lend credence to my cover story. After all, it would be suspicious to have random avian visitors for unknown reasons. Its contents were quite benign, and not the type of thing one would waste time on a reply to. "A crow?" he asked. "Your family uses demon spawn to send messages? Talk about a luxury." I cringed inwardly at the general's ignorance of the origin of crows. They may have been introduced to this plane of existence by the demons, but it was not there that they originated. True demon spawn must be crafted and cannot be bred and tamed like crows can. "What is it?" I demanded, neglecting to educate him. "The Northern Legion, He struggled to remember their given name. "The Ultras," I reminded him. "Yes, sir. The Ultras have at last joined us. They are formed up and waiting orders." "2 more legions to go then," I sighed. "Have them continue their training. If the commanders protest, have them flogged and brought before me." "Yes, sir." General Smarn bowed and left my tent. I watched the royal green flap close behind him, then turned my attention to the table that my helmet rested upon. Also upon the table was a well-detailed map that demonstrated my tactical prowess. Not that there was anyone in this camp who could even begin to appreciate it. The closest thing they'd ever seen to a tactic was to inadvertently flank an enemy when the rear lines couldn't get to the fight. Amused, I glanced at the missive that had been attached to the crow. "Dearest Kirain, are you safe yet? Esmira, sent from and signed by my youngest sister. That would be a trick. She's currently bound and gagged. To serve as food, of course. There truly is no blood quite as divine as one's own, but only the blood of others can nourish. As such, having family members is quite a boon. The other vampires were jealous of this, but then they were jealous of a great many things. My position, my manner, my power, and even my mission. To them, a half-breed like myself rising to such a station is abhorrent. To them, one such as I, rising so high only serves to demonstrate how low they've fallen. To them, I'm merely an uppity tool, and I've no doubt that some of them plan to assassinate me when they get the chance. But even a half-breed like myself has defenses. It's not as if I asked for this honor, either. My mother was insane and desperately hated King Lofin. He had executed her father and forced her to marry his favorite noble. My father, on paper, was a duke and very well off. My mother's father was a count and barely qualified as nobility. Most women of the kingdom would have been honored, but my mother was furious. Not because she loved her father or hated the duke, but because she perceived the king's actions as a slight against her. She openly admitted such to me, with pride in her voice. She had readily agreed to the vampires' plots when they approached her. They needed someone in the king's inner circle, and she was able to provide that. This lasted through the birth of my older brother, but then the plot evolved. They wanted a general who could conquer lands and help them secretly build an army. So she laid with an elven vampire that looked somewhat like my father. The result of that coitus was myself, a half-breed vampire, and my father was never any the wiser. When a vampire lays with another vampire, the resulting offspring is a vampire brood, a twisted-looking thing, similar in appearance to a common ghoul. It is much stronger than a ghoul and just as smart, but it's much easier to kill than a true vampire. One needs simply to hack it up during the daylight and the sun would do the rest. A brood's regeneration was much slower than even my own, which is already only about half as fast as that of a full vampire. When a vampire lays with a mortal, the result is an abomination like myself. A half-breed, as they call it. Half-breeds are more similar to true vampires than the brood are, but aren't as physically strong. We also age, which is damned near blasphemous to those who've lived for thousands of years. How can we truly be vampires if we are shackled by time like the cattle are? Regardless, my mother was more than happy to give birth to me for a chance at revenge. She made certain to take very good care of me and never let a wet nurse anywhere near me. She would jokingly tell the wet nurses that I was a biter. But it wasn't a joke. I needed blood every day at that stage, and every day she would whisper to me what my purpose in life was, as well as what would happen if anyone else found out about it. It gave me nightmares, but I kept it together. Better than she did, at any rate. On my 15th birthday, she snapped and murdered my father and older brother, stabbing them both repeatedly as they slept. The latter was convenient, as his assassination was forthcoming anyway. I inherited his share of the titles and lands, and the inbred bastard ordered me to execute my own mother to demonstrate my loyalty. She smiled at me as I took her head. The hardest part about it was resisting the blood smell. I immediately got rid of most of my newly acquired staff and replaced them with loyal servants who were in the know. The excuse I gave was that the prior staff was unable to prevent the assassination of my father nor my brother, so I could not trust that they had not conspired with my mother. After that, they were grateful to leave the manor alive. My two younger sisters became my primary source of sustenance. "Did you write this?" I jokingly asked the covered cage in the corner of my tent. Not getting a reply, I walked over to the cage and kicked it. A small muffled sound answered me. Esmira, my youngest sibling, bound and gagged with silk and kept very weak by regular feedings. I would feel sorry for her, were she not just as vicious and vindictive as my mother. I remembered my 12th birthday party, where she began to spread rumors that I had sexually assaulted a maid. My crime was that I had hidden her doll for a day, 6 months prior. For that, I was imprisoned and beaten severely by my father. When her actions were discovered, she grinned and admitted that she was joking around. Her punishment had simply been a scolding from father. Morn, my other sister, was much better behaved and quite well taken care of back at the manor. She still served as a source of sustenance when Esmira became nearly drained, but she was far more willing to part with her blood so that her older brother could conquer the world. Mother had taken her into our confidence early on in life. Morn detests Esmira, and it was her idea to put Esmira in her current situation to ensure I had a source of blood. Truth be told, the blood isn't a requirement for survival anymore. It was when I was a child, but around my 8th birthday I started to be able to survive on normal foods. That's one of the benefits to being a half-breed. It's much easier to pass as a mortal. However, doing so will lead you to being weaker than the average mortal, and all of the benefits to being half-vampire will quickly diminish. I'd had to starve myself of the blood for years to adequately demonstrate my weakness to King Lofin. The king was fully convinced that I was a pathetic worm by the time my predecessor, who had been old and frail when he'd become a Master General, died. The Master General must be weak and uninspiring, otherwise the people will follow them instead of the inbred bastard king. Lofin will likely order my execution if I'm successful with this invasion, but by then it will be too late. The vampires will have a steady source of mortals to convert and plenty of room to create armies of their own. Lofin will find it much harder to execute me now that I'm feeding again and have my abilities back. The regeneration comes in handy, but I have to be careful about who sees it happen. My ability to vanish has actually saved me from several assassins sent by rival nobles, and allowed me to satisfy certain curiosities that I had as a teenager. I've never had a reason to shapeshift into an animal, nor do I frequently partake in hypnosis. You would think that hypnosis would be useful, but it has a limited duration, and the mortal's personality drastically shifts during the process. Since it's nearly impossible to use covertly, it's only useful for preventing an imminent attack against oneself or making someone loopy enough to forget that you fed on them. Since I don't feed on strangers, it's only really useful for the former. But then, I have a sword for that sort of thing. There are other advantages to being a half-breed. Sunlight doesn't injure me at all, though most vampires are able to regenerate fast enough that it doesn't actually harm them. I'm also able to subsist on the blood of other vampires, which is another reason my kind is looked down upon. Vampire blood is not nearly as potent as mortal blood, so this is barely even a benefit. The biggest drawback of being a half-breed is that I cannot make vampires of my own, nor can I create children with mortals to make more half-breeds. I can, however, breed with another vampire to create brood. As such, a brood queen has been promised to me for my part in all this. A vampire criminal whose mind has been completely destroyed. They slice off the top of the skull and replace a good deal of brain matter with metal so that the brain cannot fully regenerate. They incinerate the part of the brain that they remove so that the vampire in question is trapped within their now useless vessel, completely docile and useful for one thing only. It's a very secretive process, but I was privy to it when they showed me my reward. I had been led down a long, darkened stone hallway into a dungeon that the vampires were currently occupying. I was led past laboratories, kennels, prison cells, and even the brood kings. There were far more brood kings than there were brood queens, which is likely an indication of the crime rate among the vampires. At last, I was shown my prize. I never learned her name, only her beauty. She had been a rather curvaceous elf before becoming a vampire. Long silver hair, alabaster skin free of any blemishes, and green eyes that didn't show even a glimmer of intellect. The lack of intellect is a bit of a turn-off, if I'm honest, but utterly necessary for her intended function. Her crime had been the murder of another vampire without just cause. Apparently, her victim had convinced her lover to part ways with her. She had tortured the victim first, cutting into her flesh for days before finally ending her eternity. A vicious streak a mile long, one that hopefully our brood would inherit. I sat down in my orc leather chair as I imagined the army of brood she would sire for me. Perhaps I would use that army to capture more brood queens, and eventually I would subjugate the entirety of the continent. If I were to do that, I'd have to give a lot more thought to governmental structure. I will die of old age eventually, and I will need to have a chain of succession if I'm to conquer the world. Yes, that would show those pompous bastards what a half-breed can do. I met my first vampire just after my mother's death. He had smiled scornfully as he informed me that my true father had been captured and destroyed by King Lofine's forces. He told me that scum like me should be honored to play the part I've been given. Even as he educated me on my abilities and the drawbacks of my form, he made it absolutely clear that he believed me to be nothing more than a mote of dust that would cause their greatest enemy to choke. I despise them. Even the vampires with more agreeable personalities made it clear that they believe me to be trash, despite my necessity to their resurgence. Once that resurgence is complete, they will be unlikely to honor their part of the bargain. But I've taken measures against that particular betrayal. The brood queen will be mine. The Night Kingdom will be mine. The world will be mine. Sir, General Smarn once again opened the flap of my tent. What is it? The Simvalrine have arrived. Excellent. Have them form up and continue their training. If the commanders complain, well, you know what to do by now, I ordered with a dismissive gesture, then grinned. One more? Chapter 30. Nick Smith, Adventurer Level 7, Human, American. It had been a few days since we left Kirkina, and the trip had been smooth so far. Nash said that since it's just us guarding the carts, we can't do training. I'm thankful for that, but I think the real reason is because he doesn't want my level to surpass his. He'd been acting a little jealous of how quickly I've been leveling up. Still, it's nice to be able to lay down, put my feet up on the side of the cart, relax, and enjoy the ride without muscle aches. One side of the road was lined with a dense forest, and the other side was a flat plain filled with various wild grasses and flowers. In the morning, the sun rose over the plain, warming us up, and in the afternoon the trees provided a nice little bit of shade to help cool us off. It was the afternoon now, and I was so relaxed that I was right about to drift off for a nap when a bump in the road sent me floating for a second. I came down hard, and Ares appeared to protect my head, but my armor did little to save my poor back. "Ah," I groaned. "Sorry about that," Imlaw said. "Not your fault, Imlaw," Nash chuckled. "Serves him right for lounging on the job." "Oh, come on," I complained. "You said that these paths are the safe ones." "Relatively safe," Yulk said with a grin. "As in, safer than the adventurer paths. It's still more than possible to run into complications out here." "Like what?" I asked. "Monsters, for one. Though they're a rare occurrence," Nash chimed in. "Out here the most common complication is banditry." "Indeed," Yulk agreed. "They don't usually leave survivors either, unless they're hoping for a ransom, of course." "What? Why not? Wouldn't that make the guards come after them?" "Not guards, soldiers. Those soldiers won't deploy until there's a pattern of disappearances, or if there's a report of banditry. So by killing the survivors, they buy themselves some time and the chance to rob more people and go to ground. Plus, if the survivors make it back to town, the soldiers will know what they're dealing with and be better prepared to bring the bandits to justice." Justice. I trialed off, thinking of all the different brands of justice that were used during the medieval times. Back then, more often than not, justice meant death. If you put up a fight, they'd kill you during it. If you surrendered, they'd execute you, usually in pretty nasty ways. It was like all the leaders back then were competing for who could come up with the most disgusting way to end a human life. I don't really know where I stand on the death penalty. I'm sure some of them deserved what they got, but it's easy to take modern justice for granted. "Yeah, justice," Nash repeated. "Can't have them killing honest folk who are just trying to make a living. Too few of them around as it is." Nash's stance on the matter caused the rest of us to fall silent in contemplation. I started running through what-if scenarios in my head to make sense of it all. Another bump in the road interrupted my musing, and I decided to adjust my seating arrangements to prevent further spinal trauma. The carts made their way along the road, the goods in the lead cart making some metallic clanging noises whenever we hit another bump. It sounded somewhat like a silverware drawer, but if the silverware were extra large and heavy. I was nearly about to ask about the contents when Imlaw turned to us with a serious expression. "Fire ahead," he said. "Looks like trouble." We scrambled up into better positions to see what he was talking about. Further along the road was a cart, on fire, and with two of its wheels broken apart, scattered along the road. There was no sign of whatever had been pulling the cart or its owner. As we drew closer, that changed. Over the sound of our carts rolling along, there was a clamour coming from the woods along the side of the road. An arrow sailed from between the trees, and Imlaw stopped the cart in alarm. I glanced at Nash and Yulk, who were already preparing to exit the cart. I drew my sword as a small man ran out from the tree line. He was in a panic and had a bit of rope tied to one of his wrists. His head turned to look at the flaming cart, and he stopped for a moment. He changed his mind about this pause as another arrow flew in his general direction, and he quickly turned and started running our way. He was so panicked that he ran a good 100 feet or so before he noticed us. All of us, Imlaw included, jumped from the cart and started running in his direction. "No," the man shouted as he continued to run. "Get back!" I paused, but Yulk and Nash continued to chase after Imlaw. A few tall orcs exited the tree line as Imlaw caught up to the man. I started to run again as my brothers passed Imlaw to fight the other orcs. As I caught up to Imlaw, I got a good look at both the man and the orcs. The man was wearing fancy clothing, a blue tunic with shiny leather shoes and gold trim on everything. He looked a lot like the guy who was with the High Chief, but his face was different. The rope attached to one of his wrists had an empty loop, and his free hand was bleeding. The orcs looked tough, even by orc standards. Covered with little more than pants and scars, They shouted a challenge at my brothers. There was little doubt regarding what was going on. These orcs were bandits pursuing an escaped kidnapping victim. There was a loud pop as I passed Imlaw, and I heard the dwarf shout something from behind me. I turned to look and saw him laying flat on the ground, with Imlaw looking down at him with a confused expression. "What's going on?" I shouted. He turned around to say something, but a thunderous sound drowned him out. I felt the weight of Ares appear on my head, and a moment later I was lifted from my feet and sent sailing through the air. My vision went dark for a time, and when it returned, my ears were ringing. I rolled onto my side and tried shaking my head to clear the sound. It didn't work. What the hell was that? An explosion? From where? I quickly looked around and saw Imlaw helping the dwarf to his feet. Both of them were covered in dust, but Imlaw had it all over. He must have been thrown just like me. I glanced at my brothers. Yulk was on the ground, and Nash was bent over him. I tried to get up, but my arms felt like jelly. I collapsed back to the ground. I had to see if Yulk is okay. He's got to be okay. If not, As I tried to get to my feet again, I felt a hand on my shoulder and looked up to see Imlaw. He mouthed something, but my ears were still ringing. I concentrated hard to hear him through the sharp, steady tone. It began to fade, and I was finally able to pick up what he was saying. Nick, are you okay? Can you get up?" he asked, his voice sounding very concerned. I managed to get to my knees and noticed that my right hand was bloody. As I raised it up to look at it, my hand's shadow traveled a bit, and I saw the sunlight hit the ground under my hand. Why can I see the ground through my hand? What kind of optical illusion is that? I almost laughed, but then the pain set in. There's a hole in my hand. It's big enough to put my thumb through it. How did that happen? My shoulder hurts too. Is there a hole there? Oh God, my leg is killing me. It's still there, right? Of course it is. I'm sitting on them right now. Don't panic. Calm down, deep breaths. This isn't so bad. Just wrap it up and 10 will take care of it. Yulk can help. Oh God, Yulk. Are you all right? You're blee. Huh, Imlaw said. His tone cut right through my concerns like a red-hot meat cleaver through a room-temperature stick of butter. I focused on him with what seemed like tunnel vision and noticed he was holding the upper right side of his stomach. He pulled his hand away, and I noticed that the light brown dust had become darker, as if it were wet with something. We both seemed to notice the bright crimson blood on his hand at the same time. "Oh, I'm bleeding too," he said, then looked at me. Our eyes locked, and we stared at each other in shock for a full second before I watched his eyes roll into the back of his head. He seemed to fall in slow motion, and I tried to catch him, but I was moving even slower. Everything hurt, but I pushed through the pain to stop his head from slamming into the ground. I grit my teeth through the sharp pain as his head connected with my injured hand, but the pain doesn't matter. He needs help. How can I help? What should I do? "Yulk! Yulk!" I shouted, looking around. "Yulk's out cold," Nash shouted back. "Imlaw's been hurt. Bad." I heard a metallic clang and turned to look at Nash. He was fighting off 2 bandits who had somehow survived the explosion. He was using his 2 swords this time. 1 sword for each bandit. I noted that the remnants of the flaming cart were no longer intact. That must have been where the explosion came from. Feeling numb, I looked back at Imlaw. He was pale. Too pale. "Hey boy," someone said. I looked up and saw a dwarf. That's right, he was the one who told us to run and get back. Why didn't we listen? If we had, Imlaw would be okay. How do I fix this? This can't be happening. How do I make him okay? What do I do? "Here, put this on his wound and push down," the dwarf said, handing me a bundle of cloth. "He's out, so don't worry about hurting him. We've got to staunch the bleeding." The cloth was blue with gold trim. It looked familiar. I glanced at the dwarf and noticed he was missing his sleeve. He'd ripped it off, and I was now holding it. I pushed the sleeve against the center of the blood stain and pushed. "Nick," a voice in my head said. I tried to reply, but my mind isn't working right. It feels like I'm swimming without my body. How do I help Imlaw? Is Yulk okay? Should I go help Nash against the bandits? I can't. "You're adventurers, right?" the dwarf asked. I nodded. Adventurers usually travel with a healer. "Who's your healer?" The bald orc in the robe over there, I gestured with my head, but he's hurt too. The dwarf looked over my shoulder and got a nervous look on his face as he noticed Nash fighting two bandits at once. Nick, Imlaw's wound indicates that his liver has been struck with shrapnel. You need to check for an exit wound. How do I do that? I said out loud. Check his back for a similar wound. The dwarf gave me an odd look as I rolled Imlaw to check his back. I couldn't see, so I wiped my hand on a clean part of my pants and swiped it across his back. It came back red. Blood, so much blood. He's bleeding in the front and the back. How do I stop the bleeding? I can't push on both sides at once. He's going to die and there's nothing I can do about it. Shit, the dwarf hissed. We need a healer. He said he was going to spend more time with his family, that he'd retire from the road after this job. This delivery would let him hire on employees to do the majority of the work for him, and he'd finally be able to see his wife and kids more. He'd stop being an absentee father, and his kids' lives would be better for it. He's a good person. This isn't fair. Kid, the dwarf said gently, putting his hand on my shoulder. Why did this happen? I don't understand, I said, dimly aware of the tears streaming down my face. My cart had a bunch of mining equipment in it, including explosives, the dwarf said quietly. Those assholes decided that I'd make a good hostage, but my equipment wasn't worth their time, so they torched the cart. Imlaw's breathing was shallow. What can I do? Stitches wouldn't work. He'd need surgery to seal up the internal bleeding. A tourniquet? How do you put a tourniquet on a stomach wound? Maybe if we cauterize the wound. But would that just make it worse? If only I could. I don't know if this will work or not, but try casting a healing spell. Imagine the wound healing. That's right, magic. I felt myself snap back to reality, and I spread out my fingers and imagined the wound closing. But that didn't work. My magic core wasn't primed. I took a few deep breaths, and while it was charging, I tried to imagine a liver with a hole in it. Then imagining the hole closing and the liver being intact. I closed my eyes to get a better mental picture. Come on. Minor heal unlocked. Leia Ronim Tzak, my mouth said. I felt a tingle as the magic traveled from my chest, through my arm and out my fingers. I willed it to continue, pushing all the magic I could into it. I kept charging my magic with deep breaths, refilling my core and mixing the magics even as it was being drained. It somehow felt like sprinting. Is it working? I asked Ten. I can't tell. The clothing is blocking our view of the wound. Lift it up and check. Not yet, I want to make sure. I kept the spell active until I felt the last sputtering of magic flow through my arm. My magic core was fully drained. I felt light-headed as I lifted his shirt to check his wound. I blinked my eyes heavily a few times as I looked upon his freshly mended skin. There was a slight red mark to indicate where the hole had been. He's healed. The dwarf was surprised. You're a healer? I wasn't a minute ago, I panted, trying not to pass out. I blinked my eyes again and shook my head to stave off the tunnel vision that was forming. Not working. Actually, come to think of it, what are you anyway? He asked. I managed to say before I passed out.